Chapter 121, Superpowers. Ethan's power to reshape reality springs entirely from his imagination and the energy he pours into it. There really is no hard limit on what he can do. With a thought, he can transmute people into objects, turn landscapes into living creatures, or bend any aspect of existence to his will. Thanos himself demonstrated the reality gem's potential on 3 memorable occasions. First, when he reconfigured the Collector's base in the so-called Land of Ignorance. Second, when he rewrote part of Titan's very fabric. And third, when after Iron Man's assault sent debris flying at his face, he transformed the entire building into a massive alien bird. Every reality alteration demands a proportional expenditure of energy. The duration and scale of any change depend on how much power Ethan channels and how long he sustains his focus. In essence, reality warping is creation through memory and imagination, a kind of castle in the air that lacks any true foundation. To keep that castle standing, he must continually feed it energy. Once his power ebbs, the illusion collapses. For this reason, even though Ethan can rewrite reality with astonishing breadth, he cannot tamper with its fundamental essence or causality. His modifications never become unassailable facts of existence. They endure only so long as his will and energy hold them in place. Ethan sank down on the shattered marble steps and stared at his hands, still tingling with energy. He'd finally unraveled the secret behind his reality-altering gift. It obeyed the law of equivalent exchange. Unlike Majin Buu's effortless shape-shifting, Ethan's power demanded a price whenever he bent the world to his will. Yet despite that caveat, its potential dwarfed even the most potent magic. He could rewrite any undesirable outcome, much like the legendary Izanagi technique from ancient lore. If his ability kept growing, he might one day inscribe permanent changes into the fabric of existence. What that would cost him, though, remained a mystery he wasn't yet ready to face. He let out a slow breath. Even without his other talents, reality modification alone was a stunning advantage, one that eclipsed nearly every spell or superpower he'd ever encountered. And then there was the power gem. The moment he'd absorbed it, a torrent of cosmic force had flooded his veins. The artifact was said to embody every fundamental energy in the universe, time and space, natural law and causality, all woven into a single crystalline core. Under its influence, matter, energy, and even velocity lost their meaning. They were fragments of a greater whole, and Ethan now held the sum of them all. No infinity stone, no mythical relic, could match its scope. In effect, Ethan had become the living nexus of every primal force. But with power like that came a sobering realization. He was stepping onto a path riddled with unknowns and dangers. Mastery would demand more than raw strength. It would require discipline, sacrifice, and an unwavering understanding of balance itself. He rose to his feet, resolve hardening in his chest. The world had just grown infinitely more complex, and Ethan knew he'd have to learn its new rules before he could rewrite them for good. Ethan stared in awe as he discovered the true nature of his new ability. It didn't just bend the rules of logic, it shattered them outright, bending the forces of the multiverse, natural law, physical law, even abstract concepts, to his will. Any source of power became his to command. In that moment, he realized his superpower was nothing less than absolute power. Wait, is this the same ability Dojian has? Ethan whispered, incredulous. He recalled Dojian's gift. The more unwavering his confidence, the stronger his strength, defense, speed, and superpowers grew, so much so that people called him the Marvel Superman. His freezing breath and heat vision rivaled Kal-El's, but they depended entirely on his self-belief. The slightest flicker of doubt could sap his might or leave him shattered by a blow even the weakest enemy Kua, D-Land. Maintaining that level of confidence wasn't as simple as it sounded. No one can truly lie to their own heart. Even if Dojian convinced himself he could catch a planet hurtling straight at him, a sliver of uncertainty would still echo in his mind, and that small crack could be all it took to bring him down. Ethan glanced down at the tiny fragment in his hand, knowing that even this sliver of energy was enough to sharply limit his opponent's strength. With Dojian's legendary might, whenever he fought with absolute confidence, no one in the universe could stand against him, except the god-tier warriors, the true deities of the cosmos. Among mortals, Dojian was unrivaled, and by god tier, they didn't mean a minor spirit like Bambi. They meant the architects of the universe itself. Even the celestial god clan, feared throughout the heavens, would be driven to their knees if Dojian chose to unleash his full power. Now, Ethan had tapped into a similar phenomenon, a power born of absolute certainty, an idealistic force that mirrored the perfect strength model once believed to be the domain of Superman alone. This ability allowed him to shatter his own limits, multiplying his strength, speed, defenses, and energy output far beyond his previous peak. It even sharpened his mind and fortified his soul. The more unwavering his confidence, the more potent his combat prowess became. In theory, Ethan could achieve a 400-fold increase over even a Super Saiyan 3 without suffering any of the usual drawbacks. Pure, unchallenged power lay at his fingertips, and with it, he stood ready to reshape the battlefield. Ethan paused to survey the cosmic cube with a growing smile. The only potential drawback left is an energy shortage, he mused. But with unlimited stamina and boundless power, I've already overcome that. He had absorbed the Reality Stone's ability to reshape matter at will and the Power Stone's raw destructive force, two extraordinary gifts that directly bolstered his combat prowess. Much stronger, he thought, than mere auxiliary skills like passive reality alterations. Now, holding the cube itself, he wondered, if he absorbed its cosmic energy, would his transcendence ability grow even stronger? Could his instantaneous movement and teleportation become truly unbeatable? He couldn't wait to find out. He knew Thanos must have felt the activation of the two Infinity Stones, but so what? The Ancient One still wielded magic, Odin still reigned in Asgard. Thanos wouldn't dare set foot on Earth again. And if he did, well, Ethan was more than ready. He could flatten the Mad Titan like a pair of pancakes with a single punch. He tapped the cube's smooth surface, remembering another warning. You can't remove it from this chamber. Once it's outside, it loses its power and reverts to an ordinary gem. That might limit his immediate options, but Ethan wasn't worried. With the reality and power stones already fueling him, and the full might of the cube just beyond his grasp, there was nothing in the universe that could stand in his way. Ethan shook his head, then crushed the outer shell of the cosmic cube beneath his boot. Fracturing with a crystalline pop, it revealed a dark blue space gem embedded at its core. Without hesitation, he seized the gem and let its alien energies flood through him. Immediately, the gem's power resonated with Ethan's cells, triggering a second mutation. Waves of pure spatial energy whipped around him, and he felt new abilities unlocking within his mind. His mastery of time manipulation and instantaneous teleportation remained intact. But now, alongside these, he had awakened a brand new power, space compression. Ethan tested it instinctively. With a mere thought, he watched a length of empty air before him shrink and condense, as if the universe itself had folded inward. Objects caught inside the compressed field diminished in size, fitting into impossibly small pockets of space, an obvious boon for storage. Yet the true might of this ability lay in its deadly potential. Sinks, the fabric of space itself, was what was being squeezed. Any matter within risked being crushed by the overwhelming pressure. Ethan understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just a convenient trick for stashing loot. It was a weapon more fearsome than the gravity of neutron stars or the singularity at a black hole's core. And with it, he could reshape entire battlefields, or trap his enemies in an unrelenting vice of compressed reality. Ethan smirked. Even Majin Buu can't roar his way out of compressed space, right? Concentrating, he pressed his palms together and folded reality inward. In an instant, a pocket of space, no larger than a molecule, materialized in his hand, and everything caught inside contracted along with it. Chapter 122, Nick Fury's Thoughts. Ethan's ship pierced the atmosphere and touched down at the remote S-Shield outpost just before dawn. He emerged, weary but unbowed, clutching 3 of the coveted Infinity Stones. News of his return spread like wildfire through the base, and every agent on duty snapped to attention. Yet no one greeted him. Nick Fury was too preoccupied with a graver crisis. Across the globe, the cosmic cube had vanished. Fury learned of its disappearance the moment Ethan set foot on Earth. In the current climate, Hydra cells resurfacing in every continent, striking with impunity, control over reality itself was no longer theoretical. Fury had long intended to reopen cube research, to harness its limitless power for new defensive technologies. Although S.H.I.E.L.D. scientists had once sketchily explored its potential, Fury never fully committed the agency's resources. Until now. With the cube missing, he felt betrayed and exposed. Fueled by rage and suspicion, Fury ordered a lockdown. Every agent, researcher, and support staffer on the base was herded into interrogation rooms. Hydra's methods have always relied on infiltration, he growled, pacing before a wall of security monitors. They studied the cube decades ago. They know what it can do. If someone on our side knows where it went. He cut off, glare hard as flint. He snapped his fingers. Pierce. Within moments, Alexander Pierce, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., stepped into the operations center. Fury didn't bother with pleasantries. I suspect Hydra has sleeper agents in our ranks. We're going to root them out, starting now. Assemble your trusted people. Initiate Operation Clean Sweep. No one leaves this base until we find the leak. Pierce nodded, expression grim. Fury's resolve was ironclad. The hunt for the cosmic cube, and the traitors who coveted it, had begun. To curb the director's unchecked authority and avoid a repeat of Hoover's abuses, all of Nick Fury's operations now require the Security Council's sign-off and the explicit authorization of his superior, Alexander Pierce. Not that Fury always bothers to wait. More than once, he's simply overridden them, leaving the Council powerless to rein him in. Every time Pierce hears the word Hydra, he feels his headache coming on. He and the other Hydra commanders have been scouring the globe for months, hunting the elusive Black Caesar. But not only have they turned up nothing, they've also drawn unwelcome attention from other shadowy syndicates. Whispers travel fast in the underworld. What's Hydra planning? Are they aiming to dominate all the clandestine networks on Earth? Hydra's leaders dismiss such chatter as trivial. After all, they've earned their reputation as the ultimate clandestine power, dark emperors of a hidden realm. Yet even emperors grow weary of endless questions. It took months to pacify those prying organizations and quiet their suspicions. Now, just as Hydra begins to settle into relative calm, word spreads that Nick Fury intends to launch an internal audit of S.H.I.E.L.D. Once again, every file, every operation, every secret will be on the table. And Hydra's patience? It's wearing dangerously thin. What happened? Nick Fury's gaze cut through the gloom of the briefing room as Agent Franklin Pierce entered, face ashen. Pierce swallowed. Sir, it's the cosmic cube. It's gone. Fury slammed a fist on the table. Gone? After all the security we put in place? That's impossible. Pierce squared his shoulders. I've questioned every operative on duty at the base. None of them saw a thing. They reported nothing unusual. Then, after their shift, they found the cube missing. Every one of them says they don't know how it happened. Fury paced the length of the table, mind racing. So this wasn't a straightforward break-in. Someone, or something, with inside access. Hydra? Pierce shook his head. I don't buy that Hydra could have infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. so deeply. We dismantled their cell networks years ago. They shouldn't have the means or the manpower to pull this off. But they've turning up in the shadows, Fury retorted. They tracked down targets we'd long written off as unreachable. They hit us where we thought we were safe. Clearly, they've rebuilt some of their strength. Pierce conceded reluctantly. Their audacity is growing. If they've managed to snatch the cube, they're already steps ahead of us. Fury stared down at the empty pedestal where the cosmic cube once gleamed. No more mistakes. I want every channel open, every lead chased, and bring in Ethan, our best tracker. If anyone can find what or who took the cube, it's him. Pierce nodded. I'll have him on the plane within the hour. As Fury watched Pierce leave to summon Ethan, he felt an old, familiar determination settle in. Hydra had struck first, but they wouldn't strike twice without paying the price. Ethan had always assumed that these shadowy magnates guarded their movements so carefully that even the FBI would struggle to trace them. Yet here he was, listening as Fury laid out a far more disturbing explanation for the head serpent's uncanny inside knowledge. Ethan weighed two possibilities. Either these adversaries possessed some unimaginable superpower, or worse, there was a traitor at S.H.I.E.L.D.'s core. Now, with the cosmic cube missing, the second scenario no longer seemed far-fetched. Hydra must have wormed its way into the very heart of their organization. In the conference room, General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Pierce's face was a study in denial. Fury, you're suggesting S-Shield itself has been compromised? That's unthinkable. Nick Fury met Pierce's gaze steadily. I know it pains you to hear it, Thad, but we can't dismiss a possible fact just because it's hard to swallow. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. If Hydra's agents have infiltrated the FBI and CIA as well, it explains how they anticipated every move. And if that's true, we need to act right now. Pierce's jaw tightened. At over 50, the legendary founder of S-Shield was not accustomed to feeling blindsided by his own creation. He cleared his throat, but the words stuck. Fury placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Trust me, I'll root out the Hydra moles and restore S-Shield to what it was always meant to be. Ethan watched the exchange, tension coiling in his chest. Fury's confidence was unwavering, but Ethan knew better than to take any promise at face value. Trust was exactly what Hydra would exploit. As Fury turned to leave, Ethan steeled himself. If the walls of their own agency were infested with enemies, only one course remained: find the traitors before they found him. Ethan sat at the long conference table, watching Director Pierce and Nick Fury lock eyes. 9 out of the 10 agents assigned to the Snake and Shield operation are Hydra plants, Pierce said quietly. If we launch a full-scale investigation, Hydra will know exactly what we're doing, and Fury will pick up on it immediately during his questioning. Fury leaned back in his chair. His steel-gray eye studiously avoided Pierce's. So what's your proposal? Pierce didn't hesitate. We keep this small, a handful of interrogators, handpicked by us. No wide announcements, no mass roundups. Hydra's prisoner dilemma gambit only works if they can manipulate the system and spread fear. If we contain it, they can't. Nick Fury chewed his lower lip. He knew Pierce was right. A massive purge would shatter S.H.I.E.L.D.'s morale and tip Hydra off that their cover was blown. Better, he realized, to snuff out the traitors one at a time. Finally, he nodded. All right, we do it your way. Relief flickered in Pierce's eyes. Fury returned to his office, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Once inside, he opened a heavy steel drawer and withdrew a single file labeled Avengers Initiative. He flipped it open, scanning the mission statement he'd long kept hidden. If now isn't the time to pull these people together, Fury thought, when is? He tapped the folder with a gloved finger. The Avengers Initiative would finally see the light of day, and it was exactly what S.H.I.E.L.D. needed to handle threats that no one man or agency could face alone. Nick Fury's mind raced after watching Captain Marvel single-handedly turn back the entire Kree armada. If Carol Danvers alone could rout that fleet, what hope did Earth's defenses really have? And now, in broad daylight, a second superpowered figure had appeared, Emperor Ethan. A prodigy who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, Ethan's brilliance even surpassed Fury's high opinion of Tony Stark. He'd developed a human enhancement process far superior to the old super soldier serum. Nothing like the crude Superman drug or compound number 1. This was a direct, self-administered transformation that infused Ethan's body with unbelievable strength, made him impervious to conventional weapons, granted him lightning-fast reflexes, and allowed him to unleash devastating energy attacks. If Fury hadn't already confirmed that such abilities lie beyond any natural mutant's potential, he'd be convinced Ethan was a mutant using advanced biomodification. Chapter 123, The Birth of the Iron Suit. Nick Fury paced the length of his private briefing room, staring at the hollow projection of Hydra's latest superpowered agents. The only known force capable of holding Ethan in check was General Ross's green behemoth, the creature the world had come to fear as the Hulk. Yet Hydra's ranks had swelled with so many enhanced operatives that violent, superpowered attacks were fast becoming routine. Fury knew Ethan's talents better than anyone. He had already weathered threats far worse than Hydra's rogue scientists, outfitting his own security detail with cutting-edge biotech to rival any metahuman ability. In fact, countless wealthy clients, working in the shadows, had quietly hired super bodyguards of their own, desperate for that extra layer of protection. And Ethan himself? Gifted beyond measure, he was almost certain to be developing new countermeasures for Hydra's godlike threats. Rumor had it he'd refined his recent human augmentation project into something even more formidable. With Hydra poised to strike again at any moment, Fury was convinced the UN Security Council would greenlight his Avengers initiative once they saw the severity of the threat. But winning Ethan's allegiance was another matter entirely. At barely 25, Ethan's genius and self-confidence rivaled, and perhaps even outpaced, that of Tony Stark in his prime. Charming as he could be, he was notoriously independent and wary of authority. Fury knew that no simple contract or chain of command would bind him. Recruiting Ethan would take more than a paycheck and a promise. It would demand trust, respect, and the promise of real collaboration, qualities Fury wasn't yet sure he could offer. As he watched the flickering lights dance over Ethan's dossier, Fury understood the challenge ahead. Convince a man whose very name had become synonymous with self-reliance to put his fate and the fate of the planet in a team. Ethan's youth belies the extraordinary power he wields. By capitalizing on Hydra's terror campaigns and surrounding himself with elite super bodyguards, he's built an extensive and fiercely loyal network of assets. Yet it's his raw strength that matters most. The United States government has concluded that without a heavy armored division at their disposal, they simply cannot contain him. In today's world, power, cutting-edge technology, and deep pockets are the only currency that truly commands respect. Possess only the tech, for example, and you'll find it appropriated by shadowy interests before you can blink. What does S.H.I.E.L.D. offer someone like Ethan? From his vantage point, it's not an alliance at all, but an object of envy. Nick Fury covets the resources and capabilities that back Ethan's rise. But without an underlying mutual need, Fury knows he lacks the leverage to sway him with pleas of righteousness. Meanwhile, Ethan has been turning Hydra's attacks into a lucrative business, and he has every reason to keep the status quo. He pays no heed to public opinion or moralizing voices who insist that if he's so capable, he should strike first at the superpowered Hydra threat infiltrating the world. Beneath the surface, wealthy elites and corporate magnates have launched a concerted media blitz to lionize or demonize Ethan for their own ends. But despite the PR onslaught, he answers to no one but himself. In Ethan's calculus, only actions, not words, define who truly holds the reins of power. Ethan sat quietly in the command van, watching the screens light up with images of the demonstration crowd. Ordinary bystanders gawked, thrilled by the spectacle, just spectators snacking on metaphorical melons. But for the real targets, those wealthy capitalists in the government and boardrooms, the stakes were far more sinister. Fury's voice crackled over the radio. They want maximum casualties. All we can do is reach them before it's too late. Deep inside his makeshift workshop, Tony Stark wiped sweat from his brow. He'd scavenged parts from the Jericho missiles, titanium casings, rocket propellant, and was in the final stages of forging a new Iron Man suit. Unlike the crude caveman-forged armor he'd first built in a cave, this version would benefit from proper high-temperature furnaces and precision alloy casting equipment he'd jury-rigged together. The result? Materials far stronger and more reliable than anything he could hammer out by hand. "It's finally done," Tony muttered, half to himself. "I was just about to pass out from heat exhaustion." He stepped back, chest rising and falling, as the suit's panels slid into place around him. Ethan pulled up the camera feed and nearly blinked in surprise. The silhouette in the workshop no longer looked like the bulky, primitive Mark I. Instead, the armor gleamed with a sleek silver sheen, more Mark II than Mark I, with an unmistakable hint of the war machine aesthetic. Dozens of small launchers and barrels dotted the exterior, each packed with the same explosive compounds Tony had harvested from the Jericho warheads. "They're lethal," Ethan whispered to his headset. Ethan whispered, "Those rockets, Stark's turned them into weapons far deadlier than before." "Understood," Fury replied. "Hold tight, Ethan. We move the moment he's ready." Outside, the city thrummed with tension. Inside, two men prepared to change the balance of power, one racing to contain a crisis, the other forging the ultimate weapon to confront it. Ethan sealed himself into the powered armor, then kicked the door open. Half a dozen armed guards stationed outside froze when they saw him in full battle rig. He didn't hesitate. Thanks to the compound number 1 injection, his reflexes were now those of an ace pilot, far faster than any ordinary human. In the same instant, he launched a dart-like missile roughly the size of his fist. Boom! The hallway erupted in a blinding flash and a deafening shock wave. Even these so-called superhumans, cramped in a closed corridor, stood no chance. The blast tore them apart in seconds. Not even steel plating could have survived such force. Ethan had braced himself for a showdown with Hydra's elite, but as he strode deeper into the facility, he realized only this small squad had been posted, and no one else was on duty. For a moment he hesitated, then it dawned on him. To hold a base against a single superhuman without thermal weapons, you really don't need many guards. This place is nothing but a Hydra stronghold. Tony Stark burst out of the underground complex and stepped onto an endless expanse of sand. The barren wasteland stretched to the horizon. He might as well have emerged into the Sahara. Fortunately, he'd fitted his suit with short-range flight thrusters. Pulling a quick lever on the back of the armor, he unleashed a blast of smoke and fire. The 100-plus-pound frame soared upward, rocketing into the sky. Compared to the crude Mark I he'd built under duress years ago, this new prototype brimmed with raw power. Its missile-grade components gave it range and thrust the old suit could never match. For miles, he coasted above the dunes. When the fuel finally petered out, Tony plummeted toward the desert floor. Yet, astonishingly, the armor's reinforced shell held together. Aside from a handful of loose screws and some scorched plating, it survived the impact intact. He climbed from the wreckage and slogged across the sand for what felt like 100 miles. His enhanced physiology kept him moving long past human endurance, but even he was on the brink of collapse when he finally spotted a lone figure on the horizon, a desert nomad. At that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't some alien world. He was in Afghanistan. Hydra's foothold ran deep in the tribal highlands here. Word of Tony Stark's narrow escape and his sudden reappearance rocketed across the globe. Stark Industries' stock, which had been plummeting amid his disappearance, rebounded overnight on the relief that its genius founder was alive and well. The share price hasn't rebounded, it's merely stopped its free fall, because Tony Stark still hasn't appeared, and nobody can confirm whether the rumors about him are true. In the meantime, Galvatron quietly amassed a fortune speculating on Stark Industries. He snapped up distressed shares from panicked investors and even seized assets held in dormant accounts at Citibank and other banks. Obadiah Stane has tried to buy back shares, but his resources pale beside Galvatron's. Today, Ethan officially holds the position of Stark Industries' second-largest shareholder. Even Stane himself owns fewer shares. Monarch Technologies may be flush with cash, but Stark's equity remains far more valuable. After all, in the opening of Iron Man 1, when Tony Stark sold missiles to the U.S. military, he famously quipped that he'd throw in a case of rare wine for every order over $500 million. That single deal alone anchored Stark Industries at a $500 million valuation, proof of just how high the stakes really are. Since these are major assignments that require Stark's personal attention, there shouldn't be many of them, let's say around a dozen each year. Chapter 124, Tony Stark's Fear. Ethan studied the latest export reports from Stark Industries, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the figures on the screen. He already knew that bulk arms sales to the United States generated about $6 billion in revenue each year. But when you factored in the smaller contracts, roughly a quarter the size of the major deals, that added another $1.5 billion, bringing America's total annual business with Stark to $7.5 billion. As America's single largest defense contractor, Stark Industries thus accounted for nearly 10% of the U.S. military's external spending. In 2006, that overseas budget was estimated at about $85 billion. Even if you look at the broader picture, some $150 billion earmarked for weapons procurement and R&D, with procurement alone exceeding $80 billion. Stark's share still seemed surprisingly conservative. Ethan leaned back in his chair, recalling the darker side of Stark's empire, the dealings that Tony Stark had exposed in Iron Man's first battle. A former business partner had secretly diverted weapons shipments to third parties, seeding Stark-manufactured arms into every hidden cache it could reach. The most notorious example was the Ten Rings headquarters, where stolen Stark guns, missiles, and armor parts were stacked from floor to ceiling. If that much hardware had leaked out once, how many more clandestine clients might be arming themselves with Stark's technology right now? Let's say this segment represents only about 1/10 of total weapons sales, roughly $800 million. Stark Group's military-industrial division pulls in approximately $8.3 billion in annual revenue. Companies in this sector typically enjoy very high margins. 60 to 70% gross is common, and a 30% net margin is hardly outlandish. By those standards, the division would generate about $2.5 billion in profit. If we then assume a 30% return on equity, Stark's net assets would total around $15 billion. Of course, when valuing a high-tech company, net assets alone don't tell the whole story. Despite those sizable figures, Stark isn't what you'd call asset-heavy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. With just a few thousand employees, it operates a classic asset-light model. And while the U.S. stock market is generally praised for its stable, sensible valuations, especially compared to China's A-shares, its enthusiasm for cutting-edge technology firms remains unmistakable. Ethan settled into his chair, palms pressed against the smooth desktop as he ran the numbers again. For a defense and energy powerhouse that constantly pulses with innovation, could the market really justify a price-to-earnings ratio of 20 to 25? He flipped through the annual defense spending reports on his tablet. U.S. military outlays had climbed steadily every year. If Stark Industries' valuation, roughly $90 to $112.5 billion, held firm, it would rival Facebook's worth at its IPO. And yet, despite Stark's seemingly astronomical market cap, Tony Stark himself wasn't among the handful of trillionaires the tabloids love to imagine. Ethan tapped his stylus against the screen. Stark Industries was a public company. Tony was only one of many shareholders. Comic lore suggested that S.H.I.E.L.D. had quietly amassed a controlling stake in the firm, subtly coercing it to prioritize their weapons contracts. If that were true, Tony's own stake must be well below 50%, perhaps closer to 30%. Even Obadiah Stane's rumored 13% share would, by comparison, give Stark a stronger individual voice on the board, but still not absolute control. Leaning back, Ethan exhaled. The picture was clearer now, a $100 billion company, led by a public icon, but still beholden to a patchwork of shareholders and shadowy powers behind the scenes. No matter how brilliant Tony Stark's inventions, his personal empire would always be balanced on the votes of others. And that, Ethan mused, was as much a testament to Stark's success as it was a warning about the limits of corporate power. With Obadiah Stane's backing, Tony Stark held virtually all the real power at Stark Industries. The combined stakes of the remaining shareholders, those holding the third largest block and a handful of smaller investors, didn't even total the single digits. Recognizing a chance to profit before Tony's return, Galvatron quietly swooped in, investing both time and money to acquire as many of those dwindling shares as possible. After all, no one wanted to see a once hundreds of millions dollar asset collapse into oblivion while they waited for their star CEO to resurface. Ethan, however, had encountered a far tougher challenge. Both the Department of Defense and S.H.I.E.L.D. were determined to retain their positions. At first, he expected the military's shareholding to be an easy sell, yet they dug in their heels. Leaning on every connection he'd built over the years, Ethan eventually persuaded them to part with nearly all of their stock, boosting his personal stake in Stark Industries to a staggering 25%. A few die-hard officers still held out, but their combined holdings were so minor that Ethan didn't even bother to track them. S.H.I.E.L.D., ever cautious about the ripple effects of advanced weapons and alien technology, refused to budge. They held firm on at least 10% of the company, ensuring they'd have both a financial stake and a seat at the table whenever Stark's projects took a turn for the unpredictable. For Ethan, these moves were more than just aggressive stock deals. They were the foundation of a new power structure. With a quarter of Stark Industries secured under his name and S.H.I.E.L.D. watching every corporate maneuver, he'd effectively reshaped the balance of influence. The only remaining question, would Tony Stark ever return to challenge him? Ethan and Galvatron had secured every asset they could, every portfolio, every piece of leverage. With Tony Stark's unexpected return and Stark Industries' stock rallying on the markets, the two conspirators stood on the brink of a fortune. When Tony finally touched down on American soil aboard a military transport, Pepper Potts was there to meet him. In an instant, all the tension of his disappearance melted away as she wrapped him in a tight embrace. Tony pulled back only long enough to flash that familiar grin and announce his first priority. "Pep, I need the biggest, juiciest cheeseburger you can get me." Smiling indulgently, Pepper took his hand, but neither of them could ignore the fallout waiting upstairs. Rumors, investor jitters, political questions. Tony faced a mountain of complications, yet he made one decision immediately. He would not close Stark Industries' weapons division. In this version of events, he'd never witnessed the Ten Rings turning his own technology on Afghan civilians, a crucial divergence orchestrated by Ethan. Without that atrocity burned into his conscience, Tony still saw himself as a suave playboy tycoon, not a crusading hero. At most, he thought, he was a playboy who happened to wear a high-tech suit of armor. Proud of the Iron Man prototype's success, Tony retreated to his workshop in the bowels of Stark Tower. There, amidst sparking arc reactors and half-finished schematics, he dove headlong into new experiments, driven by intellect, ego, and the thrill of invention. Chapter text. The moment Tony Stark's return was confirmed in public, Stark Industries' stock price shot back up, stabilizing almost immediately. Traders whispered in surprise. Even without the rare materials needed for an arc reactor, why was Stark so determined to build one? Why not simply rely on his enhanced physiology to power a combat suit? Watching the live feed on his Galvatron display, Ethan found himself just as curious. In the Hydra stronghold, Stark hadn't secured the exotic elements for an arc reactor. Instead, he pushed his own supercharged metabolism to its limits, using it as a makeshift power source for the armor's servo motors and energy systems. When the tests were over, Stark still announced plans to develop his signature reactor technology. On the surface, it seemed unnecessary. After all, why trade a functioning prototype for months of research? But Tony Stark wouldn't settle for merely a powerful suit that trundled across the battlefield like a metal tank. He saw it as an open target, vulnerable without the compact, limitless energy of an arc reactor. What drove his obsession wasn't just technological pride. Ethan suspected Stark was sizing up his own iron suit project. Outwardly, they looked similar, but Ethan knew the secrets he'd engineered into his armor were leagues beyond anything Stark had yet revealed. And while Stark had shown remarkable ingenuity under pressure, he'd never cracked the code of Ethan's design. Now, driven by rivalry and ambition, Tony Stark was bent on building not just an Iron Man armor, but the ultimate Iron Man armor, one that could finally outclass Ethan's. Ethan switched off the feed with a thoughtful nod. Let him try. He'd been ready for a challenge like this all along. Ethan had already pushed the limits of human biology with his self-applied modifications, let alone the experimental nanite compound running through his veins. Even if he managed to slip back to Amelie's safe house, there was no guarantee Hydra's superpowered operatives wouldn't track him down. Their network reached from the United States all the way to Afghanistan, and any security card or digital key he carried could be compromised. That's why Tony Stark felt so exposed. His trademark bravado vanished the moment he realized that without his armor, he was just another target. He'd even considered asking Ethan to retrofit him with the same cutting-edge biotech enhancements. If Ethan could turn him into a walking weapon, then maybe he'd finally have a fighting chance. But in the end, Stark's confidence rested on a different kind of technology, his steel suit. It was bulky, noisy, and far from invisible, but it was also ironclad. Right now, that suit, and the layers of defenses he'd built into it, was the only thing standing between him, Pepper, and the full wrath of Hydra. Chapter 125, A Chance Encounter in the Sky. Tony Stark wasted no time developing the Mark II suit. Stripping away every unnecessary component of the Mark I, he transformed it into a streamlined first-generation war machine, bristling with heavy ordnance. Ethan watched in awe. Has he developed a phobia of underpowered weapons? He murmured to himself. Does Stark Industries even make conventional firearms anymore? Ethan's gaze fixed on the massive sniper rifle slung over Stark's shoulder. Its two-finger-wide muzzle looked more than intimidating. It was clearly designed to pierce superhuman defenses. Gone was the rotating Gatling cannon of the original war machine. In its place, Stark had opted for a high-precision, high-penetration, high-velocity shoulder-mounted sniper weapon. According to Stark, energy weapons were flashy but terribly inefficient in this atmosphere. Nothing could match the proven lethality of live rounds when facing enhanced foes. As Tony completed the final diagnostics, Ethan felt a thrill of anticipation. High above the city skyline, destiny was about to unfold, and with the Mark II's arrival, the balance of power was shifting once again. Ethan had somehow altered his body to shrug off 7.62mm rounds at point-blank range. How? Tony Stark couldn't begin to guess. Now Tony was staring down the barrel of his own creation, a shoulder-fired 14.5mm anti-material sniper rifle. No matter how tough Ethan believed himself to be, tough as steel, some said, Tony was confident this weapon would punch right through him. After all, no human enhancement could rival the armor of a battle tank, could it? In its tests, this rifle penetrated an 80mm homogeneous steel plate with a single shot. Swap in a tungsten core armor-piercing round, and that figure climbs even higher. Tony's brand-new Mark II suit had just rolled off the assembly line, and he was itching to take it up for a spin. Strapping himself in, he couldn't help but wonder. There's no way Ethan can fly like this, right? Once airborne, Tony reveled in the rush of wind and the exhilaration of flight, only to have his mind return to Ethan. The guy hadn't just survived bullets. He'd unleashed concentrated energy blasts with the force of artillery. And if he could do that, what kind of power reserve was fueling his ability to soar through the sky? How can any human body generate that much energy? Tony Stark stared at the readings in disbelief. What are you? A calm voice crackled in his ear. Sir, an unidentified flying object has just entered our sensor range. Its power signature is off the charts. We might never have noticed it if it hadn't announced itself. Jarvis's typically unflappable tone betrayed a hint of alarm, but Tony barely registered it. He whirled around and froze. Hovering before him, arms relaxed at his sides, was the very figure whose power he'd been tracking. Emperor Ethan. Tony's jaw dropped. You can fly? Ethan tilted his head as if the question amused him. Of course. Why else would I be airborne? Tony frowned, recalling his own confidence that no one else could match his flight systems. That's strange. I thought I was the only one who could take to the air, and here you are, flying too? Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. We both rely on technology, yes, but our approaches differ. My suit runs on multiple arc reactors. Miniature turbines hidden throughout my armor generate lift and thrust. It's all self-contained. Tony's eyes widened. So you're saying your entire body is basically a power plant with propellers? With a soft hum, Ethan extended his arm. Sleek panels slid open along his forearm, revealing a cluster of spinning rotor blades. Precisely. I'm a walking reactor. Tony shook his head in awe. That's incredible. Your whole suit functions like a swarm of turbines. Ethan folded his arms again, the glow of his armor pulsing rhythmically. Just another day at the office. Tony tapped the side of his helmet to power up his HUD. Suit's ready. Let's see whose tech comes out on top. Ethan's eyes gleamed. With leisure. Under the lab's glaring lights, two of the world's most advanced armors faced off. One built on stark ingenuity, the other on an emerging empire's hidden reactors, each ready to prove its supremacy in the skies above. Ethan dropped onto the rooftop as if gravity were a suggestion rather than a fact. His dark, armor-like suit swallowed the impact without so much as a whisper of recoil. He simply landed, completely unshaken. Tony Stark watched, every micrometer of his Mark II armor whirring in anticipation as Jarvis's smooth voice filled his helmet. No meaningful deceleration forces detected. His suit appears to dissipate all kinetic energy. Tony raised his visor. I'm Stark, he announced. Ethan crossed his arms and took a slow, assessing step forward, towering over the Mark II's polished steel. So it's you, he said, voice cool with recognition. No wonder I felt something new in the air. This must be the latest Stark Industries prototype. Tony's grin gleamed through the helmet slit. Mark II, he said proudly. Faster, tougher, and it laughs at Hydra's experiments and your pal the super bodyguard. Ethan nodded once, respect within the glance. All right, let's see what it can really do. With that, he lunged. Tony didn't move to block. He simply stood his ground, bracing for the first strike. Jarvis chimed again. Brace for impact. Estimated force, 700 psi. And then the test began. Ethan reached out and pinched the armor's forearm. Crack! A sharp, unsettling sound echoed from the gold titanium shell. I'm sorry, Mr. Stark, Ethan said with a half-smile. I didn't realize it was so delicate. Warning, armor integrity at 5%, Jarvis announced calmly. Tony Stark stared at the dent where Ethan's fingers had squeezed the alloy. It hadn't fractured, proof of its toughness, but it was bent enough to feel almost mocking. This is gold titanium alloy, he said, disbelief heavy in his voice. It wasn't the strongest material humanity had produced, but it was satellite-grade stuff, heat-resistant, impact-proof, state-of-the-art. Stark had always prided himself on superior tech, but this, Ethan's prototype, had just bested it effortlessly. How is this possible? Tony asked, stepping forward. What did you do? He needed answers, and he needed them now. Ethan raised an eyebrow at Tony Stark's silence. He had been sure Stark would seize on this moment. He'd expected something along the lines of, "Can't wait to see it in action," followed by a friendly challenge to test how durable the prototype really was. When nothing came, Ethan felt an odd pang of disappointment. "As I said," he shrugged, "that's a trade secret, Mr. Stark." Tony drew in a slow breath, clearly fighting a smirk, or perhaps a surge of irritation. Finally, he let out a low, amused chuckle. "Is that so? Don't flatter yourself. Give me time. I'll have a suit far more advanced than yours before you know it. Your technology will be the one falling behind." Ethan met Stark's gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting in a confident smile. "By all means, let me know when you're ready to show me." With that, Tony excused himself and strode from the room, his expression unreadable, but his stride purposeful. Back at home, he wasted no time once he stepped into his workshop. Blueprint sheets, spare armor plates, and power cell prototypes were spread across every surface. He paused only to mutter to himself, "Mark 1, Mark 2, time to start work on Mark 3. He grinned, tapping a finger on a design that gleamed with new ideas. "Initially, I thought to call it the Anti-Ethan suit, 2 on the nose. No, much better. From here on in, this baby's the Anti-Emperor suit." With that, Tony Stark turned to work, already plotting how he would outshine and outsmart his newest rival. Chapter 126, Stirring Trouble and Guiding Tony. Tony Stark never realized he'd actually crossed paths with Ethan in midair, and even if he had, he wouldn't have gone around broadcasting it. What did catch his attention, though, was Ethan's claim that the Iron Suit was Stark Industries' newest prototype. That simply couldn't be true. No matter how impressive Ethan's demonstration had been, the armor had to be Ethan's own work. Tony knew that cutting-edge technology always stayed in Stark's hands for several generations before filtering out, and he was certain the Iron Suit wouldn't reach the civilian market anytime soon. More importantly, this suit was fundamentally different from Stark's original Mark 1. Ethan's armor could fly, boasted mobility far beyond most military vehicles, and carried both anti-tank and breaching ordnance, making it lethal in stealth operations. Of course, global radar networks and air defenses still posed a threat, and the suit had no defense against incoming supersonic missiles. Yet even so, it was a formidable leap ahead of anything on the battlefield. One unarmed super soldier can slip through every line of defense. No matter how many of them you deploy, you still won't be able to stop him. Armored units, on the other hand, are tough to lock onto, but painfully slow and clumsy compared to a man in an iron suit, and those suits can be armed with anti-armor payloads. Tony realized that, armed with a single iron suit, he could neutralize every one of these so-called enhanced soldiers, rendering Compound Number 1 a mere curiosity. If Tony mass-produced his iron suits, however, it would upend the entire balance of power. Ethan knew this and was desperate to force Tony's hand. Every taunt, every leaked rumor of a new suit prototype was calculated to push Tony into accelerating his development. Tony, already teetering on the edge of what his friends jokingly called the curse of knowledge, resisted, but he hadn't abandoned his fallback plan. When the time came, he would unveil his ultimate countermeasure, an anti-Ethan suit. He'd boost its power to just the right level, strike Ethan's network, and then destroy that prototype to keep the technology from falling into the wrong hands. It was a reckoning he planned to stage on his own terms. For now, at least, a tense peace prevailed. High-value targets had hired advanced bodyguards, plugging the security gaps Ethan once exploited. Hydra's signature terror attacks had ground to a halt until Ethan found a new move in this deadly game of chess. Even the best bodyguards in the world couldn't shield every VIP if things really went south. Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. We can stage a little skirmish for effect, but there's no need to throw ourselves into genuine peril, then it wouldn't be acting at all. Besides, what's the point of socking your own people? Hydra's been spread thin lately. Why don't we give them a new headache? He paused, picturing the fallout. Targeting Hydra could be entertaining. Agent Pierce tearing his hair out, S.H.I.E.L.D. scrambling to handle the chaos. Yet Ethan knew there was a fine line. Push them too far, and Hydra might decide to eliminate Nick Fury and seize global power outright. And without official approval, the new Insight-class warship couldn't even take off once it was built. He tapped a finger against his mug. Here's a thought. Let's sabotage those Insight vessels before they ever get airborne. That'll shred Hydra's already limited patience and blindside them at the same time. A slow grin spread across Ethan's face. With the threat of their own battleships mysteriously disabled, Hydra wouldn't know whether to laugh or panic. Of course, he'd need the means to pull it off. Without real leverage, even the boldest bluff wouldn't force their hand. But if he could deliver a decisive strike, Hydra wouldn't dare to strike back. Ethan's favorite pastime was watching his opponents' faces contort in frustration when they realized they were utterly outmatched. But a new, more delicious idea had just taken shape in his mind. What if he allowed the Insight battleship to launch, then, at the height of its crew's complacency, struck it down? The image of their confident smiles snapping into horror filled him with glee. He hesitated, torn between options that both promised equal doses of thrill. Choosing the perfect moment to betray the battleship or sabotaging it before launch, each possibility was more intoxicating than the last. As he weighed his schemes, he found himself envying Guyi. How exhilarating it must be to glimpse countless threads of the future and pick the one you like best. Shaking off the daydream, Ethan turned his attention to the latest iteration of his suit. Since Tony hadn't been provided with all of Ethan's biometric data, he'd played it safe by building the armor entirely from the toughest composite alloy available. Multiple metal layers were fused together to maximize defensive strength, while advanced structural mechanics refinements reinforced every joint. Tony had painstakingly applied each panel, bit by bit, using powdered alloy laydown and precision laser welding. The result was a protective shell that outclassed the Mark II by a wide margin, albeit at a correspondingly high price. Best of all, Ethan had insisted on installing 2 arc reactors instead of 1, doubling the Mark III's power output. Leaning back, Ethan let himself imagine the moment he'd test this suit in the field, and the look on their faces when they realized they should never have taken him lightly. Chapter 7. Tony Stark stamped a foot against the floor of his workshop, frustration sparking behind his eyes. No matter how many simulations he ran, he still couldn't reconcile the facts. A man, Ethan, had managed to crush a gold titanium alloy bar with his bare hands. A metal bar designed to resist military-grade hydraulic presses. A suit of armor was one thing. A human being simply shouldn't be able to do that. That realization gnawed at Tony's pride. He ran a hand over the familiar indentation in his chest where the arc reactor pulsed beneath his skin. He hadn't gone through the pain of embedding the reactor just to discover it was outclassed by a man's fist. The device not only powered his Iron Man suit, but also kept shrapnel from reaching his heart, its radiation-shielding layer warding off the palladium poisoning that had nearly killed him once already. 2 arc reactors, reinforced by cutting-edge structural mechanics, meant he could lift cars with a fingertip, swing tanks like baseball bats, and batter through walls that once would have taken dozens of tanks to break. Yet none of it mattered if Ethan could waltz up and shatter a gold titanium beam like it was chalk. Tony replayed the moment in his head. The alloy yielded instantly, a clean break, as though built from nothing stronger than wet paper. It defied every rule of material science he knew, rules he'd helped write. Jarvis's calm voice chimed in over the comm. "Sir, at present, the optimal strategy is to avoid close-quarters engagement with Mr. Carter. His unassisted strength exceeds the maximum compressive force of your current suit. I recommend either disengagement or an immediate upgrade to your armor's power plant and structural load capacity." "Great," Tony muttered, staring at the blueprint of his next-generation Mark IV suit spread across the holo display. "Jarvis, Did you really just tell me to run away, or to make a stronger suit that he might still crush? There is a 32% probability that even a double reactor configuration would fail to contain his strength, Jarvis replied without inflection. Tony scowled. He hated relying on probability. He hated that Jarvis knew it. Fine, I'll give it a shot anyway. He tapped a command, and the workbench retracted. Around him, the cavernous workshop hummed with idle servos and half-finished Iron Man prototypes. In another hour, he'd dive back into schematics, pushing the reactor output, thickening the alloy joints, rerouting power to the new kinetic dampers. He'd solve this problem, one way or another. But first, this couldn't wait. He needed to see Ethan again, to test him, learn the limits of his physiology. Better to find out in controlled conditions than on some battlefield. And Afghanistan was the next best laboratory. The locals had reported strange seismic tremors near a suspected terrorist compound. Intel hinted that Ethan might be there, moving like an unstoppable juggernaut through desert sand and concrete bunkers. Within minutes, Tony climbed into the cockpit of the Mark III armor, his current workhorse, and sealed the hatch. Jarvis initiated the launch sequence. The suit's repulsors flared, lifting him silently off the ground. Tony's jaw set. He didn't know how Ethan did what he did, but he would. And once he cracked that mystery, not even the strongest punch in the world could break his suit or his spirit. With a streak of red and gold, Iron Man rocketed toward Afghanistan, determined to uncover the secret behind a man who defied all he thought possible. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the schematics glowing on the holoscreen before him. The old Hydra hideout he'd been monitoring was long since abandoned, and in the months since Tony Stark's dramatic return, the whole world knew Stark Industries had reclaimed its assets. Whatever secrets lingered in that crumbling base were likely exhausted. Still, the location held value. With Tony's attention drawn there, Ethan could engineer a distraction powerful enough to expose whoever, or whatever, was hiding in the shadows. He tapped a few commands, summoning live satellite feeds and encrypted comms logs. Then he grinned. If he could bait Tony into an encounter with the Ten Rings, Stark would unwittingly tip his hand to Hydra's new allies. Better yet, using his contacts, Ethan arranged for a small cell of Ten Rings terrorists to stage a weapons reclamation at the site. All Tony would see was evidence of stolen Stark ordnance. Guns, missiles, arc reactor cores, ripe for the Iron Man's intervention. By the next morning, Ethan's plan was in motion. High over the Nevada desert, Tony Stark checked the diagnostics on his Mark III armor. The lack of an updated map left him relying on memory, but his enhanced cognitive interface, courtesy of the arc reactor's neural link, kept every contour of this terrain etched in his mind. He keyed in the coordinates Ethan's mole had provided, then rocketed toward the long-dormant Hydra headquarters. "Sir, I'm picking up movement at Ground Zero," Jarvis reported, his calm British tones layering the suit's HUD. "Movement?" Tony frowned. "Details. Small arms signatures, possibly foreign-made assault rifles, plus a few heavy weapons. And thermal readings indicate 3 or 4 armed personnel, moving in tactical formation." Tony's jaw tightened. "Sounds like mercenaries. Could be 10 Rings." If so, he thought, they may have stumbled onto those old weapons caches Ethan was so keen to expose. Despite the odd coincidence, Tony was eager. "Let's hope it's Hydra renegades. I've been itching to pay them a visit." He dove through the cloud cover, engines roaring, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, awaited him below. With the Mark III in peak form, he felt confident facing any conventional threat. His only real concern was if the mastermind pulling the strings had armor, and the only one he feared was Ethan. But today, at least, the battlefield lay clear. Advanced terrorists versus Iron Man. And Tony never backed down from a fight. Ethan's helicopter touched down precisely on the designated drop zone, the rotor wash whipping up a swirl of desert dust. When the sand settled, he spotted a small group of militants, clad in the loose tunics, woolen packholes, and rugged gear characteristic of local Afghan fighters, approaching the landing site. A flicker of unease ran through him. Had the locals uncovered something unusual here and come to investigate? Chapter 127, Contrast. Ethan hovered above the rocky Afghan plateau, the Mark III armor's polished gold and red plates gleaming in the harsh sun. Below him, a handful of insurgents, Terrorists who'd sworn to fight any force claiming to liberate Afghanistan scrambled for cover. Their weapons shook in trembling hands when they recognized the armor. They were facing a one-man strike team from the Free Democratic Republic. "Disarm yourselves," Ethan's voice crackled through the suit's speaker system. Panic rippled through the group. One young fighter squeezed the trigger of his AK-47 in desperation. Instantly, Ethan flared a repulsor burst from his right palm. The beam, charged by dual-arc reactors, cut through the rebels' makeshift barricade and sent him flying against a boulder in a spray of dust and bone. The remaining gunmen recoiled, horror-stricken, as the non-lethal setting Ethan usually relied on proved tragically excessive. He'd reconfigured both his palm and chest repulsors, officially designed to stabilize the armor in flight, to fire concentrated muon beams. In theory, these beams were defensive, but in practice, they were fearsome offensive weapons. "Last warning," Ethan warned, leveling his gauntlets at the survivors. The insurgents dropped their rifles and raised their hands in surrender, helmets clattering to the ground. Within seconds, the plateau fell silent. Ethan deactivated his repulsors and scanned the area one final time. Not a single friendly casualty. The Mark III had performed flawlessly, its repulsion rays turning a potentially bloody ambush into a textbook takedown. Over the comlink, Colonel Ramirez's voice crackled to life. "Target neutralized. Outstanding work, Ethan." Ethan allowed himself a brief nod inside the helmet. The terror in their eyes, the contrast between their frantic resistance and surrender, this was the moment that proved the power of his technology. But in a land where every scare could conceal a new threat, he knew this victory was only the beginning. Ethan's suit was more than just a shield. Besides deflecting solid projectiles and neutralizing energy blasts, its repulsor arrays could be dialed up to slice through steel, blast massive craters in rock, or even vaporize a target outright. With every system focused, the lowest power setting could punch clean through the toughest military-grade ballistics plate. The nearest terrorist never stood a chance. One repulsor blast struck his chest, instantly vaporizing tissue and bone, leaving a fist-sized hole straight through to his back. His body went slack, hanging by the mantle of still-smoking flesh. The others opened fire in panic, but their rounds pinged harmlessly off Ethan's armor, hardly even scuffing the finish. He waited only a heartbeat, then throttled his foot thrusters. In a blur of motion, he closed the gap and drove a knee into the nearest man's skull with brutal force. The impact crushed cervical vertebrae, splintering bone and tearing nerves as gore sprayed outward. Before the remaining assailants could recover, Ethan executed a low-altitude spin and unleashed twin palm repulsor blasts. Two more terrorists disintegrated mid-air, one reduced to a charred torso, the other with half his skull and brain matter simply evaporated. When the smoke cleared, Ethan stood alone amid twisted bodies and scorched earth. There was no time to linger. More threats undoubtedly lay ahead. But for now, the immediate danger was over. Tony Stark hovered 60 feet above the desert floor, repulsors glowing. Below him, a pot-bellied terrorist screamed as a rupture blossomed in his midsection, an ugly rent that sent crimson entrails gushing into the dust. Stark's jaw tightened. The palm energy cannon in his armor could obliterate bunkers, but the carnage was almost too much to watch. He deactivated the cannon and dropped into hand-to-hand combat. With the Mark III's servo motors amplifying his strength, a single punch could shatter bone. One by one, the remaining terrorists reeled under his blows, knuckles crashing into helmets, boots sway, eeping legs out from under them. Before long, the entire cell turned tail and fled. Stark let them go, for now. He'd trace their footprints back to the Ten Rings stronghold, then reduce it to rubble. The local U.S. garrison would breathe easier once this nest of vipers was eradicated. Unbeknownst to him, those gunmen weren't running on instinct alone. High on a rocky ledge, Ethan had slipped into their minds. His telepathic grip forced them to race straight for the Ten Rings compound, delivering word of a seemingly invincible attacker. Inside the hideout's graffiti-scrawled walls, the Ten Rings leaders clustered around a battered holoprojector, comparing Hydra's old propaganda reels. They'd fought the super soldiers of Hydra, monsters who shrugged off missiles and assaulted American targets, time and again. But these terrified refugees claimed even those juggernauts would have fled from Stark. Before they could dismiss the story, the ceiling above them shattered. Stark descended in a blaze of engine flares, landing amid the shattered concrete with a ground-rattling thud. The terrorists froze, eyes wide beneath their masks. The man in gleaming red and gold armor was no phantom. He was very real, and he was very angry. The 10 rings braced themselves. Tonight, one side would not walk away. Tony hit the ground hard. "Jarvis, scan the area," he ordered. His helmet's heads-up display swept the scene, and Tony's eyes narrowed. Dozens of Stark Industries-made weapons lay strewn about. "How did these get here?" he asked through the suit's translator, but the terrorists offered no answer. Instead, a .50 caliber M2 Browning mounted on their transport vehicle erupted in gunfire. The old warhorse roared, spitting out steel-cased rounds in a relentless hail. First introduced in 1921, the Browning M2 remains a staple of the U.S. military, with an effective range approaching 1,800 meters. It can suppress enemy positions, shred light armor, and punch right through wooden and sandbag fortifications. Bullets screamed toward him, but Tony didn't dodge. His armor, though stretched to its limits, held firm. Ethan planted his feet firmly, unshaken even under the withering fire of the terrorists nicknamed Laogan Ma M2 heavy machine gun. Calmly, he raised his armored palm and released a repulsor blast. The beam tore straight through the gunner's position, shattering the thick riot shield in its path. In seconds, the hillside was littered with bodies, yet Ethan spared a handful of prisoners. He needed answers. How had weapons from Stark Industries, ones he himself designed to secure America's victory and liberate occupied nations, ended up in this remote Afghan stronghold? The militia wielded complete launchers and warheads of the Jericho missiles, hardware far too sophisticated to have been cobbled together on the black market. Ethan crouched beside the captives, his visor reflecting their terrified faces. He recalled the only group capable of stealing Jericho's blueprints: Hydra. If Hydra were involved, these fighters wouldn't be isolated here in such harsh terrain. They'd have bigger bases and deeper cover. But when he grilled them earlier, they didn't even know the name Hydra. "If it wasn't Hydra," Ethan said, voice low and controlled, "then who supplied you with these weapons?" I am." Under Ethan's telekinetic grip, the captured terrorist struggled for breath, finally choking out the name he'd kept hidden. Ethan and Galvatron already knew the identity Obadiah Stane had used to deal with the 10 rings. If Tony Stark continued his investigation, he'd soon unravel the entire operation, and Ethan would not let that happen. It would spoil Obadiah's carefully plotted rise to become the Ironmonger in the original storyline. Instead, Ethan devised a new plan. He'd feed Tony's armor designs and his probe into the 10 Rings weapon supply through Obadiah, exploiting the fact that Stark had never officially shut down his weapons division. That way, Stane could keep meeting with Tony under the guise of munitions negotiations, all Lempower, leaking every critical detail back to Ethan. But the existing Ironmonger suit wouldn't stand a chance against Stark's upgraded Mark III armor. No problem, Ethan would simply commission an even deadlier prototype, Steelmonger, ensuring Obadiah had the raw power to crush Tony. Ethan thrived on turning Stark's setbacks into personal victories. First, Obadiah would pin Tony to the ground and humiliate him. Then Ethan would repeat the feat with Obadiah, proving whose strength truly reigned supreme. That very night, as Obadiah entertained a few young models in his penthouse, black-suited operatives moved in and spirited him away into the shadows, exactly as Ethan had planned. Chapter 128. The Hydra is so terrifying. Obadiah huddled in the corner of the dimly lit room, every muscle tense with cold and fear. He'd been snatched off the street the night before, stripped of his clothes, and left in darkness until a single scrap of cloth was thrown his way. Now facing him in the flickering torchlight was his kidnapper's masked figure, Ethan, the man the underworld whispered about as Black Caesar. Obadiah's eyes widened behind his ragged shirt. "You're Black Caesar?" The man laughed, a low, measured sound. "That's the name they gave me. I considered Darkseid, Lord Shaffron, even something ridiculous like Jokemaster. But Black Caesar has a nice ring to it." Obadiah's jaw dropped. "You're aware of all their data on you?" Ethan shrugged, stepping closer. The room's single bulb revealed glimpses of finely tailored combat armor beneath his cloak. "Galvatron can compile every scrap of behavior and strategy he wants. He thinks he can predict my every move, lock down my core program, but I don't plan to be controlled. If he tries, all he'll get is a shattered chessboard and an overturned table. Obadiah swallowed hard. Why me? What do you want? Ethan's masked gaze held him. Compliance, for starters, and loyalty. The Hydra grows stronger by the hour, and everyone plays a part. He paused, voice softening as he offered a gloved hand. Welcome to Black Caesar's world, Mr. Obadiah. Ethan stood motionless in the steel-walled chamber, the only light coming from a barred window high above. His face was hidden behind a matte black mask, featureless, void-like, with two dark hollows where his eyes should have been. Obadiah's heart pounded as he studied that empty gaze. Without the mask, he would have recognized Ethan in an instant. But Ethan preferred his prisoner to imagine the worst. Mr. Black Caesar, what do you want from me? Obadiah croaked, voice trembling. He was well into his 50s, long pampered, and last night's brutal interrogation had already robbed him of half his nerve. Now, trapped in this suffocating space, he felt utterly broken. Ethan tilted his head. After a moment he spoke, low and measured. Anthony Edward Stark. At the mention of Tony's full name, Obadiah's eyes widened. If you're here to kidnap Iron Man, I'll help you. Just tell me what to do. He swallowed hard, willing himself to stand firm, but his fear betrayed him. Survival mattered more than loyalty. A cold chuckle escaped Ethan behind the mask. We're not interested in Stark. We want to work with you, Mr. Obadiah. Before the older man could gather his wits, Ethan snapped his gloved fingers. In an instant, a holographic display sputtered into life in front of them. Blueprints, data streams, surveillance feeds, painting a stark picture of just how pivotal Obadiah's cooperation would be. The realization hit Obadiah like a blow. This was bigger than Tony Stark, and now he had no choice but to listen. Ethan had never laid eyes on technology this advanced, and he certainly hadn't expected Hydra to possess anything like it. Yet here it was, sleek, formidable, and unlike any weapon he'd encountered. On the screen before him, Tony Stark in his gleaming Iron Man armor descended upon a compound of 10 Rings operatives. In seconds, the terrorists were neutralized, their stronghold left in smoldering ruins. Ethan's breath caught. He replayed the footage, convinced he'd misread it at first. Is this Tony Stark? Obadiah Stane stood beside him, jaw slack. He'd heard rumors of Stark's brilliance, but nothing prepared him for this. A flying suit of armor, armed to the teeth. Yes, Ethan replied quietly. That is Mr. Stark. No question, he's a genius. He's built a weapon that could redefine warfare. Obadiah swallowed hard, still staring at the screen as Iron Man rocketed into the sky. In that moment, he realized this was more than a single device. It was a revolution in military technology, on par with the first tank or the debut of strategic bombers. A new chapter was beginning. Then Ethan's words struck him with fresh urgency. Tony already knows who you really are. With Stark's intellect and resources, Obadiah thought, what will he do when he comes after me? The promise of a bright new era in weaponry suddenly felt like a threat. And somewhere up there, Iron Man was watching, waiting for his next move. Obadiah Stane hardly needed to think twice to realize that Tony Stark already knew exactly who he was. Stark wouldn't waste time unmasking some petty shell company. Anyone with the clout to divert Stark Industries' weapons shipments would have to be right at the top. Aside from Pepper Potts, there was only one man who fit the bill. Of course, Tony had seen through his disguise the moment they met. Stane leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Mr. Black Caesar, he said, adopting Ethan's assumed name, let's cut the niceties. What is it you want from me? Ethan smiled, unperturbed. It's simple. We team up. I help you take down Tony Stark, and in return, you let Hydra receive half of every weapons shipment Stark Industries sends to the Taliban and the 10 Rings each year. Obadiah's lips curled in a sardonic half-smile. Weapons? You must be joking. Stark's supply lines are airtight. There's no way he's funneling arms to Hydra. Exactly, Ethan said, chuckling softly. That was always a bluff. The Emperor Company already has its own arms division. Firearms, munitions, the works. We don't need Stark's hardware. I only floated the idea to prove I have insider access, so now you see there's no alternative but to work with me. Am I right? Stane's cool gaze didn't waver, but he gave a slow nod. You're right, Mr. Black Caesar. We have an understanding. Excellent, Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair. Now, about that little procedure I mentioned. Don't worry, it's routine. You won't even feel it. He offered a reassuring smile, already 3 moves ahead in his own game. Ethan held Obadiah's gaze steadily. Would you like to know exactly what we did? Obadiah hesitated. His voice was faint, hoarse from the anesthetic. I'd rather not, he managed to say. You said it was just a minor procedure to guarantee our cooperation. Ethan nodded, as if confirming what Obadiah already suspected. The surgery was no mere formality. But Obadiah had no choice. He swallowed hard, unable to refuse. 30 minutes later, Obadiah awoke. Blinking against the harsh light of the recovery room, he sat up and stumbled toward a nearby mirror. Staring back at him was his own pale face, now topped with a closely cropped scalp. Across the crown of his skull ran a thin pink scar. He ran a hand gingerly over the lines of the incision. What is this? He whispered. Ethan stepped forward, eyebrows raised. Don't worry, the scar will fade in a few days. By the end of the week, no one will be able to tell you ever had surgery. Obadiah's throat tightened. Then what exactly did you do to me? Ethan folded his arms. You now carry a human bomb. Obadiah's fingers froze midair. He forced himself to meet Ethan's eyes. A bomb? Ethan nodded. Yes, a tiny explosive device that we've linked directly to your brainwaves. The moment anyone tries to remove it, or if we think you're going rogue, we trigger it remotely. Your brain detonates, and the blast is powerful enough to flip even a tank within 50 meters. A cold sweat broke out on Obadiah's forehead. He pressed both hands to his scalp, as if expecting to feel metal beneath his skin. I can't feel anything, he stammered. Is it active right now? Ethan offered a faint, reassuring smile. It's dormant, but it's always there. You'll live your life normally, no phantom pain, no constant ringing, until we decide otherwise. He paused. Consider it our ultimate insurance policy. Obadiah sank onto the edge of the bed, his mind racing. There was no arguing with that. The razor-thin scar on his skull was proof enough. From now on, his life was no longer entirely his own. Ethan offered a calm, reassuring smile. Mr. Stan, there's really nothing to fear. We've already run this procedure on countless volunteers, dozens, even hundreds, and none have experienced complications. You're not our first success story. But instead of relief, a chill crept through Obadiah. Countless volunteers? He recalled the uncanny precision of every Hydra-led attack, each strike flawless, every security detail outmaneuvered as if guided by a single mind. Suddenly, it made brutal sense. This operation wasn't just some experimental surgery. It was a tool for total control. Obadiah's thoughts raced. How many high-ranking officials, generals, and bodyguards had fallen under Hydra's sway? How many decisions in the corridors of power were no longer their own? If this procedure could bend so many to a single will, then Hydra's reach was absolute, and their victims walking time bombs. Faced with that reality, the notion of joining Hydra, of becoming one of the privileged few, no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like the only path to survival. Chapter 129, Tony's Fate. Obadiah knew that, despite Hydra's claims, he wasn't truly one of them. At best, he was just a useful asset. Mr. Stark escaped from our control with that suit, he reminded them, voice cold. Then we found his armor abandoned in the desert. Ethan nodded. Show him, he ordered quietly. A pair of agents led Obadiah down a dimly lit corridor to a reinforced hangar. There, resting on a raised platform under surgical lights, lay the Mark I armor, the very prototype Tony Stark had engineered to flee capture. Up close, its crude welding and exposed piping looked rough, but Obadiah's expert eyes gleamed with both admiration and envy. If only he could get his hands on it, he was certain he could reverse engineer every last component. But Ethan had more to reveal. He guided Obadiah past the Mark I display to a second alcove, where a brand-new juggernaut stood, the latest steel overlord. Compared to the bulky, jury-rigged Mark I, this suit was sleek. Its limbs flowed like liquid metal, the plating seamless, with not a weld in sight. Its scale was imposing, too, taller, broader, more menacing than any Stark prototype. Obadiah's jaw dropped. You built this yourselves? He breathed. In so short a time? Ethan turned to him, expression unrateable. All Hydra's doing, he replied. We have our own manufacturing network, foundries, nanoforges, automated assembly lines, hidden all over the world. But there's one element missing. Obadiah stiffened. Key technology, he said, immediately guessing the truth. The arc reactor, or a miniature version at least. Without that, You can't power the suit in the field. Ethan tapped a command on his tablet. A holographic display sprang to life between them, flickering into focus on the front of Tony's original armor. The two reactors pulsed with cobalt blue light, vibrant, undiminished, the beating heart of Stark's design. Obadiah stared, a mixture of dread and determination in his eyes. "If you want to control these overlords," he murmured, "you'll need that reactor technology, and there's only one man who can help you get it." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then it's settled. Mr. Stain, prepare your proposal. Hydra's about to recruit more than just a tool." As the hologram flickered off, both men felt the gravity of what lay ahead, reverse engineering Stark's arc reactor, struggling for dominance within Hydra's ranks, and the inevitable reckoning with Tony Stark himself. The fate of the man who had slipped through their fingers wouldn't remain sealed for long. Ethan stared at the towering suit in front of him, hardly daring to believe his eyes. "Incredible," he whispered. "He actually pulled it off." Obadiah, even more astonished, ran through the implications. "Our steel armor prototype was solid, except for one thing: it has no internal power source. Mr. Stan, we can hand you this steel overlord design. All we need is Tony's arc reactor technology, and you'll be able to produce these suits by the dozen." Ethan nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "So that's the plan." Now that Obadiah understood Hydra's true objective, he knew exactly what to do next. He eyed the massive exoskeleton with a predator's confidence. With a weapon of this caliber, he was certain he could take down Iron Man. His own abduction had raised hardly a ripple. Back at Stark Industries, everyone assumed Obadiah had merely slipped away on one of his habitual business trips. No one suspected that he'd been meeting with Hydra, or that he'd arranged for Steel Overlord to be shipped straight to Stark's Weapons Research Division under a nondescript codename. There, Obadiah's hand-picked team of engineers and scientists would dissect every bolt and circuit in secret. Tony Stark rarely glanced at that department, preferring to concentrate on his personal projects, so the scheme was virtually guaranteed to go unnoticed. Obadiah smiled to himself. With Steel Overlord and the arc reactor combined, the future of warfare would belong to Hydra, and to him. After running countless simulations, Stark Industries engineers came to the same frustrating conclusion. Most of the Steel Overlord's systems were beyond their comprehension. They simply couldn't reverse engineer the suit in its current form. At best, they could build a crippled imitation. And as Hydra intelligence had already guessed, this prototype lacked a vital energy core. In other words, if Obadiah Stane hoped to reproduce the Overlord suit's full capabilities, he'd first have to get his hands on Tony Stark's arc reactor, and, just as crucially, strip Tony of his Iron Man powers. In the original scenario, once Stane seized control of Tony, he didn't kill him outright. Instead, he left him alive, slowly starving him of the means to power his suit. It was a cold, methodical plan. Let Tony languish until there was nothing left. And Tony, despite occasional whispers of a mole inside Stark Industries, never suspected Pepper Potts or his uncle Obadiah. Stane wasn't family by blood, but Tony had always treated him as such. He valued and trusted Obadiah without reservation. Now, late in the lab, Tony was fine-tuning a new repulsor array when he sensed someone entering. He glanced up, startled. "Stane?" he managed. Obadiah Stane appeared at the threshold, immaculately dressed in an expensive custom-tailored suit, his gaze locked onto Tony's with an unsettling calm. "Tony, is there something you're not telling me?" Tony's heart skipped. He cast a nervous look around the workshop, then forced a casual smile. "Nothing at all, just wrapping up some diagnostics." But inside, he was anything but calm, because he knew Stane was already one step ahead. Obadiah had good reason to suspect Ethan was working on something behind his back. So when Ethan balked at letting him into the workshop, Obadiah simply made his way down to the basement without invitation. Ethan's protests echoed off the concrete walls as he barreled past locked doors, but Obadiah didn't pause. He needed answers. At last, Ethan threw open the final hatch, and Obadiah stepped into the cavernous lab. There on their stands gleamed 3 new suits of armor, Mark II, Mark III, and Mark IV, under construction. The arc reactor on the workbench pulsed softly, bathing the room in cold blue light. Obadiah folded his arms and surveyed the scene. "How long did you plan to keep this from me?" he asked, voice low and calm. Ethan's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Obadiah strolled over to the table and picked up the reactor, weighing it in one hand as if testing its value. "I never meant to hide it from you," he said, setting it down again. "I was going to surprise you, Ethan." Ethan swallowed, unconvinced. Obadiah gave him a thin smile. "Catch up now, before I change my mind." Before Ethan could respond, Obadiah tapped the sides of his ear. 2 chrome discs gleamed at the base of his skull. With a soft click, they activated. A powerful electromagnetic pulse rippled outward, and Ethan's body seized as if struck by lightning. He collapsed in a heap. Obadiah crouched beside him. "You've been quite handy these past months," he said quietly, "building weapons and testing them on me when I wasn't looking." He lifted the reactor off the bench again and slipped it into a reinforced briefcase. "I won't have to keep cleaning up your mess." He turned Ethan on his side, studying the paralyzed man. "If you weren't useful, you'd be dead already." Ethan's mind raced even as his body lay unresponsive. He remembered the clandestine shipments, the secret meetings with shadowy buyers, the weapons that had turned up in terrorist hands. Obadiah had been right there the whole time, selling their technology to the highest bidder. Obadiah straightened and gave Ethan one last look before heading for the stairs. "When you wake up, we'll have a long conversation." Then the door slammed shut, leaving Ethan alone in the dim glow of the abandoned suits, a prisoner of his closest ally's betrayal. Tony Stark stared in stunned disbelief. He'd never imagined that Obadiah Stane, his guardian, his father's oldest friend, would turn traitor. Yet here he was, leveling a pistol at the glowing core embedded in Tony's chest. The target wasn't Tony himself, but the arc reactor pulsing at his heart. Why? Tony couldn't make sense of it. Obadiah's voice was icy calm. "Goodbye, Tony." The shot cracked through the workshop. Pain seared across Tony's chest, but the bullet hadn't pierced his heart. Stane needed that reactor alive. If he'd drawn blood here, Stark's home AI and security grid would have sounded the alarm, and Hydra's forces would converge before he could make his escape. With Tony disarmed but alive, Stane could walk away with the arc reactor, hand it over to Hydra, and deploy his own Iron Legion to seize control of global military power. Even if Tony died afterward, Stane had powerful allies who'd cover his tracks. He could always claim vengeance for Howard Stark and let the world believe the new Iron Man was avenging a fallen hero. A discreet assassination would risk everything. This ruthless display would serve as a far more effective warning. Before Tony could react, Obadiah activated a device on the pistol's grip. A blinding electromagnetic pulse surged outward, instantly freezing his muscles. Tony's limbs went numb, and he crashed to the floor. Chilled to the bone, he lay there, the workshop lights blurring as betrayal and panic washed over him. At that moment, Pepper rounded the corner and spotted Tony collapsed on the pavement. "Tony," she shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. Heart pounding, she bundled him into her car and sped to the nearest hospital. In the emergency bay, the surgeons exchanged grim looks. Tony had been struck by a dum-dum bullet, a hollow-point round that shatters on impact. Shrapnel lay scattered inside him, perilously close to his heart. His life hung in the balance. Ethan had never intended this outcome. He'd orchestrated every move to prevent Tony from reliving the old, bitter fate waiting for him. No matter what new role Tony took on, Ethan derived a cruel amusement from watching him forge a different destiny. Yet here he was, back in the exact same crisis Ethan had tried so hard to avert. Chapter 130. Tony. I can't believe I lost. Tony Stark's condition was spiraling out of control. Even Dr. Stephen Strange, the world-renowned surgeon, had boarded a flight halfway around the globe at a moment's notice. In the hushed emergency conference room, Strange laid out the grim facts. "Mr. Stark is in critical condition," he said. "Were he an ordinary man, he would have succumbed hours ago. We have to devise a surgical plan right now." The tension in Stark Industries' private hospital was almost tangible. Their greatest benefactor lay unconscious in the ICU, and failure here would spell disaster not only for the facility, but for every life dependent on its success. Yet none of them had fully appreciated the limits, or rather the boundless endurance, of a superhuman patient. Obadiah Stane paced the hallway outside the operating theater. Once he'd embraced the promise of Compound No. 1 himself, tempted by the ad campaign boasting invincibility and the strength to take on 5 men at once, he'd thought he'd unlocked the secret of perfect power. But compared to Tony, his own transformation had been a pale imitation. Tony's physiology had soaked up every ounce of the compound's potential, delivering results no one else could match. In fact, Tony's resilience had saved Stain's life on more than one occasion. Ethan stood nearby, hands clenched at his sides. He and Tony had been lab partners and battlefield comrades through every twist of the Compound No. 1 project. They'd pushed each other to the limit, traded quips in the lab, and watched each other's backs in every firefight. Now he was watching Tony fight the hardest battle of his life, and feeling utterly helpless. Inside the OR, Strange's normally calm voice carried a note of urgency. Prep the exoskeletal stabilizer, anesthesia on standby, and someone locate Obadiah. He needs to authorize the enhanced support protocols. When Obadiah reappeared, Ethan met his gaze. "Will he make it?" Stain asked, his voice hushed. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Tony's not out of the fight yet." In that moment, as monitors beeped and surgeons in scrub caps readied their instruments, Ethan vowed he wouldn't let his friend slip away. Compound No. 1 had given Tony powers no one else could wield, but his real strength, Ethan knew, lay in his indomitable spirit. And that spirit was about to face its greatest test. Tony's body went into overdrive, forming blood clots around the metal fragments to keep them from reaching his heart, while simultaneously scrambling to replace the blood he'd lost. The clots were a double-edged sword. They stopped the shrapnel, but jeopardized his life. When he finally drifted back to consciousness, a wild idea struck him. He would orchestrate his own surgery. Not pick up the scalpel himself, of course, but devise the entire plan, blocking his pain nerves so he could remain fully aware and direct the operation in real time without needing general anesthesia. His proposal stunned the medical team. Pepper was nowhere to be found, and Tony, despite being their patient, insisted on this radical approach. What could they do but obey their boss? Across the country, Agent Phil Coulson, sent by S. Shield to oversee Tony's rescue, was horrified when he heard the news. Director Nick Fury, likewise, was preparing to dispatch a fighter jet to fetch Dr. Steven, the world's leading surgical specialist, back to Tony's bedside. They both understood the risks. Tony's plan was unorthodox to the point of madness, but Tony Stark was nothing if not determined. Awake, aware, and fully in command, he would guide every incision, every stitch, and fight for his own life. Under Tony's orders, Agent Coulson stood guard at the single entrance to the ward. Pepper paced nearby, her hands clasped in anxious prayer. "God, please watch over Tony," she murmured. Ethan offered her a half-smile. "If you're going to pray, pray to me. He's in there now." Yet despite their efforts, no one inside seemed aware of the patient he spoke of. "Is this really what you saw, Ancient One?" Ethan asked the empty corridor. His voice carried faintly against the sterile walls, but there was no reply. Still, he was convinced the Sorcerer Supreme was watching. Otherwise, why would Dr. Strange have ventured out of the sanctum? Strange hadn't stirred from New York in years, and he certainly didn't take on cases like this. Yet here he was, summoned to treat a mysterious patient whose wealth and influence demanded the most advanced and most unorthodox surgical approach. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. Has fate itself bent to our will, or have we merely tumbled down the path it was always destined to follow? He waited for some sign, some cryptic guidance, but the silence persisted. Inside the ward, Tony Stark prowled like a caged predator. He barked orders at the medical team. "Scalpel, please, now. Prep the nanofiber graft. Prime the arc reactor modules. We don't have the luxury of conventional surgery." He explained, in rapid-fire detail, how he intended to fuse reactor energy directly into the patient's circulatory system, an unprecedented procedure that defied every textbook in the hospital. Ethan watched from behind the glass partition, his expression a mix of awe and dread. Tony's plan was bold, brilliant, and potentially disastrous. Was he on the cusp of a revolutionary breakthrough or about to unleash a fatal meltdown? The future felt precariously balanced on the edge of Tony's scalpel. And still, the Ancient One said nothing. Ethan's own enhanced physiology had already done half the work. His body had formed clots around the shrapnel, sealing off the damage before the surgeons even began. In theory, the operation needed only to clear out the fragments and remove the excess clots. But Tony Stark was never content with "in theory." He insisted on implanting a miniaturized arc reactor designed to draw in any stray metal and accelerate his recovery. And it wasn't just Stark's stubbornness at play. Agents like Walter doubtless had their own contingencies ready, and rumors said the Ancient One quietly kept watch over the entire procedure. Ethan could have come up with a dozen alternative treatments himself, but in this world, Stan Lee's world, why take the safe route when you could rewrite the rules entirely? When Tony finally stepped out of the operating theater, a soft, pulsing light glowed at the center of his chest, a living halo born of cutting-edge science. Thanks to compound number 1, his superhuman resilience kicked in immediately. Within hours, he was up and walking. His wounds began closing faster than any ordinary man's could. Better still, the new reactor's built-in filtration system let him flush out the last stubborn clots from his blood vessels. He wasn't foolish enough to chalk it all up to luck. If not for his enhanced constitution, Obadiah's shot would have killed him on the spot. Those insidious fragmentation rounds, twisted derivatives of old dum-dum bullets, engineered to wreak maximum havoc on soft tissue, were designed for one thing: to ensure there was no coming back from a single hit. Yet here he was, very much alive, and glowing all the brighter for it. Tony nodded. Of course he owed his thanks to Monarch Industries. After all, he was their customer. But beyond that, his only thought was to get Ethan to deploy compound number 2 as soon as possible. Obadiah! Pepper's fierce kiss wrenched Tony back to the present. He pulled away, brow furrowed. Don't worry, Mr. Stark, Agent Coulson said, cutting in. We already know exactly what we're up against. Coulson explained that his agents were moving in to capture Obadiah Stane. Tony held up a hand. No, you don't understand. Only I can stop him. Pull your men out, now, before someone gets killed. Shaking his head, he replayed Obadiah's betrayal in his mind. Hydra must have discovered the plans for his Mark I suit, or else Obadiah wouldn't have risked stealing the arc reactor itself. If Tony was right, things were about to get far worse. He needed to get back to his workshop fast. Coulson frowned. Sir, my agents are seasoned professionals. Even if Obadiah has mercenaries and superior firepower, they're equipped with the new super soldier serum, compound number 1. They'll match him blow for blow. Tony let out a slow breath. We'll see, he muttered, eyes already on the skies, readying for the race against time. Nick Fury frowned at the comlink after hearing Stark's report. He sat in silence for a long moment before replying. Trust Tony. Have the team stand down and let them withdraw. Fury couldn't shake the memory of that iron suit Agent Coulson had uncovered in Stark's basement. He'd filed it away as another one of Tony's flashy prototypes. Certainly no child's plaything. Then again, that was precisely what made Stark so unpredictable. Deep beneath his Malibu mansion, Tony Stark strode into his workshop with a singular purpose. He didn't need Ethan's help. Sure, Ethan had proven his worth on countless occasions, but Stark was confident he could handle this threat alone, and he hadn't bothered to warn his friend. Obadiah Stane never even realized Stark had survived the plunge. Now, as Stane's forces scrambled to regroup, Tony was already suiting up. Mark IV, he called out, coming to a halt before his latest creation, the battle armor originally engineered for Ethan. The alloy plating was thicker, the repulsors more powerful, and the targeting systems fine-tuned to Ethan's reflexes. Stark studied it, half grinning. The only way he could lose now was if Ethan somehow outmatched him, an unlikely scenario. With a flash of cobalt light, Stark slipped into the armor in seconds. He tested the joints, confirmed the thrusters were green-lit, then rocketed straight toward the ceiling. Jarvis, he announced over the helmet comm, lock on to Obadiah Stane's biosignature. Let's finish this. Chapter 131. Prepare to be humiliated. Ethan stood at the edge of the smoldering clearing, the night sky lit by the glow of burning wreckage. He picked up a charred fragment of metal, what Hydra claimed was their improved version of his Mark I armor, and let it drop back into the flames. Even if they'd reverse-engineered his suit, he thought, they still hadn't solved the arc reactor's power problem. After all, Obadiah couldn't get his prototype to run on anything but Ethan's original reactor core. By every estimate, whatever Hydra was fielding tonight couldn't possibly outshine the Mark III. Ethan's logic held true until he saw it. Towering over the treetops was not a sleek Iron Man replica, but a hulking iron mech, twice the size of his own armor. Its massive limbs and serrated plating gleamed under Hydra's crimson emblems. This war machine was something entirely new, a brute force monstrosity built to crush any resistance in its path. Back at the perimeter, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents led by Agent Coulson had closed in on Obadiah Stane, intent on seizing the arc reactor. When Hydra operatives learned of their approach, Coulson issued a sharp evacuation order. Hydra's field team complied, at least in words. They announced that a mysterious squad had extracted Obadiah and that they'd been ordered to fall back immediately. In reality, it was a flawless ruse. Under the guise of retreat, Hydra slipped behind enemy lines, spirited Obadiah away, and reclaimed the reactor core. It was pure, ruthless Hydra tradecraft, and it nearly succeeded without a hitch. Yet in their pursuit of greater power, Hydra's commanders had pushed their troops too far. Tonight's operation cost them dearly. An entire detachment of loyal operatives was lost to the firefight. Greed, it seemed, still carried a price even Hydra might regret. From the smoldering woods, Ethan watched them vanish, Obadiah in tow, the iron mech lumbering behind. He clenched his fist, determination burning brighter than any reactor. Hydra thought they'd ambushed their way to superiority. They'd made one fatal mistake. They'd underestimated him. And soon, he intended to show them just how humiliated they'd become. Hydra's action teams must not only be composed of loyal operatives, but also be empowered to use lethal force on their own authority. For that reason, Hydra subjects these squads to far stricter audits than any other department. Any loss of life weighs heavily. Even Alexander Pierce, notorious for his ruthlessness, would feel the sting of a fallen agent. Tonight, they were closing in on Obadiah's stronghold. Leading the raid was Ethan, a super soldier enhanced by Compound Number 1. Barring the Imperial Company's elite bodyguards or the mysterious powers of Lord Black Caesar, Ethan knew of no one who could stand against him. Confident, he kicked down the door and strode into the chamber. "Obadiah," Ethan announced, raising his voice so every guard could hear. "You're under arrest by order of Hydra High Command." He drew himself up, ready to vocally read the charges and begin the detention procedure. But at that moment, a low rumble echoed from the darkness. A colossal form shifted, a hulking suit of armor, its eyes glowing with blue energy, the massive arc reactor on its chest casting stark shadows across the room. Ethan froze. "What did you just say?" A deep, amused voice crackled through speakers embedded in the armor. "Hydra action team? Loyal to Hydra? No one bothered to tell me flesh and blood stood a chance against steel. And frankly, not even the Imperial Company's finest could breach a suit like this." Ethan swallowed hard, his confidence shaken for the first time. He glanced at his squad, weapons trained on the armored behemoth, and forced himself to speak. "Sir." "Obadiah, stand down. We're with S.H.I.E.L.D., the agent called out, voice calm but firm. Obadiah's grip on the massive gauntlet tightened, metal plates groaning under his strength. He hesitated. S.H.I.E.L.D.? He'd known of the organization, of course, and he still felt a surge of unease. After all, he'd eared his Iron Man-style armor, fused the reactor into his chest, and even pledged himself, however unwillingly, to Hydra. Yet deep down he trusted that America, however it deployed its covert forces, would protect him and his newfound power. Without another word, Obadiah slammed his fist forward. Two shoulder-mounted cannons flipped into position with a mechanical click and unleashed a molten plasma orb that streaked toward the agent. The blast landed with a thunderous boom, scorching everything within its radius. At its peak, the weapon could reach temperatures near 5,000 degrees Celsius, more than twice the melting point of steel, but to conserve energy, it usually operated around 900 degrees. Still, it was more than enough to turn its target into mere slag. Obadiah stepped back, adrenaline flooding his veins. He surveyed the smoking crater, then glanced down at the new weapon attachment on his arm, a Gatling cannon with barrels spinning eagerly. He let out a dark chuckle. "Now this," he muttered, "is true power." 5,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammo were more than enough to wipe out most threats in an urban firefight. S.H.I.E.L.D. agents dropped like pins, and at last the colossal Hydra mech toppled forward, its heavy alloy plates rattling against the pavement. "Sir, Obadiah's location has been confirmed, sir," Jarvis announced through Tony's HUD. Tony Stark stared at the hulking suit before him. nearly 3 meters tall and bristling with armor plating thicker than anything he'd ever seen. He still hadn't built a second arc reactor. His Mark IV needed 3 cores to run at full capacity, and he had only 1. Even at peak output, a single reactor wouldn't keep the suit online for long. And since the Mark IV had been engineered specifically to face Ethan, he couldn't help wondering if even 3 reactors would be enough. He'd expected to encounter a jury-rigged Mark I at best, some salvaged frame bolted back together. But this behemoth? What secrets connected it to his earliest prototype? Tony? Obadiah's voice crackled over the comm just as the armor clanged to the ground, sparks dancing across the street. Ethan's eyes widened the moment he saw the armor. It was an Iron Man suit, and only Tony Stark had the security clearance to use one. Yet here it stood, activated and intact, despite having just taken a direct hit from Hydra's infamous Living Dead fragmentation bomb, a weapon rumored to guarantee a 100% kill rate. Ethan swallowed hard. How on earth had Tony survived that blast? That settles it, Obadiah, Ethan whispered, dread knotting in his stomach. The suit's speakers crackled to life. Confirmed, Ethan. With a hiss of servos, the faceplate snapped open to reveal Tony Stark's determined gaze. In an instant, he charged forward, palm glowing with repulsor energy. Ethan could only pray that Hydra's black market alloy, used to rebuild Obadiah's stolen armor, was flawed. When Tony unleashed his full-power blast, it should have devastated the suit. Instead, Obadiah merely staggered back 2 steps, completely unharmed. Not bad, Stark, Obadiah taunted, raising a heavy machine gun. But you'll need more than your toys to stop me. Tony didn't flinch. His thrusters erupted, hurling him straight into the hail of bullets. With Jarvis's targeting guidance and superhuman reflexes, he weaved through the barrage. A few rounds struck his armor's surface, crackling sparks flying off the impact points, but Tony kept his momentum, thrusters roaring at full thrust as he closed the distance on his betrayer. Tony's fist sent Obadiah sprawling onto the concrete. The enormous armored body offered no resistance as Tony's gauntlet morphed on impact, plates thickening, hydraulics spiking, and energy crackling through the system. The blow shattered the visor helmet, a web of fractures spidering across the faceplate. For a moment, Tony could only stare, astonished at Hydra's cutting-edge materials science. Then Obadiah seized Tony's ankles and drove him headfirst into the ground. Tossing aside his now useless machine gun, the Tower G agent advanced on the fallen hero. If sheer mass and muscle counted for anything, Obadiah was certain his raw strength would overwhelm Tony's smaller frame in hand-to-hand combat. Chapter 132, Hydra, World Leader in Science and Technology. On the deserted city street, 2 armored titans faced off. Tony Stark, in his gleaming Iron Man suit, and Obadiah Stane commanding the hulking Ironmonger frame. With a roar, Obadiah unleashed a barrage of devastating combat techniques. Hellfall, Hulk's Return, the Porter Club President's Heaven's Gate, and the crushing Giant Strike. Each blow landed with thunderous force, and Tony was caught completely off guard. Obadiah's raw strength was overwhelming. Despite being 2 of the world's top ace pilots, each boasting reflexes far beyond any ordinary human, Stane's power advantage in his heavy armor was absolute. Stark had poured years of ingenuity into augmenting his neural interface and built-in AI, yet even his intellect and quick thinking couldn't compensate for the sheer horsepower behind Obadiah's assaults. Ethan watched from a nearby alley, his curiosity piqued. He couldn't help but admire Tony's composure under fire. Even as Obadiah grabbed him by the throat and began swinging him like a rag doll, Stark looked for any opening. Tony triggered his suit's thrusters, trying to break free, but the momentum was too great. Each spin sent him hurtling against lampposts and crumbling walls. If it weren't for the suit's cutting-edge shock absorption system, one of Hydra's proudest innovations, Tony would have sustained fatal injuries long ago. Obadiah tightened his grip, the Ironmonger's fingers biting into Tony's reinforced armor plating. Sparks flew where metal met metal, and the entire street shook with each impact. Still, Tony refused to yield. His HUD flickered, calculating escape vectors and counterstrike probabilities in microseconds. But until he gained the upper hand, he could only endure, forced to rely on the suit's advanced dampening fields to survive these punishing swings. Ethan leaned closer, silent but utterly engaged. This was more than a brawl between rival industrialists. It was a test of brains versus brawn, of innovation clashing against pure force. And under Hydra's spotlight, where every weapon, every suit, every neural upgrade pushed the limits of possibility, there was no telling which side would emerge victorious. Obadiah's gloved fist slammed into Ethan more than a dozen times, each blow rattling the reinforced plates of his powered armor. Then, Obadiah stomped down hard on Ethan's chest plate. Thanks to its specialized pressure-resistant framework, the impact didn't rip the suit apart, but when Obadiah saw that the paint had been scuffed away completely, he assumed he'd already done enough damage. "Goodbye, Ethan," Obadiah said, raising the massive cannon mounted on his shoulder. Ethan's HUD flickered as he rolled onto his back, coughing. Through the cracked visor, he could barely make out Jarvis's calm voice in his ear. "Sir, I'm picking up a weapon signature I've never encountered before." Ethan tried to sit up. "Jarvis, what is it?" "Analyzing. No comparable tech in any of our databases," Jarvis replied. "The absence of a magazine or feed mechanism suggests it's purely energy-based, possibly experimental." Ethan forced himself to his feet, brushing grit from his armor. His chest plate protested the motion, but otherwise held firm. "Can you tell if there's any weakness?" "Negative, sir. In fact," Jarvis paused, "the ambient temperature is rising sharply." Ethan's gaze snapped to Obadiah's shoulder, where the cannon's barrel pulsed blue, just as Jarvis had warned. "Plasma?" Ethan whispered, dread tightening his chest. Before he could react, the weapon discharged. A blistering jet of superheated plasma lashed at the ground beside his helmet, tearing up concrete in a deafening blast. Shrapnel sprayed around him as Ethan stumbled back, the roar ringing in his ears. He pressed himself into a tight crouch, heart pounding. Obadiah loomed over him, grin widening under the flickering glow of his weapon. Ethan steadied himself, visor steaming slightly from the heat. The real fight was only just beginning. Ethan felt as though boiling water had been splashed against his cheek inside the Iron Man suit. If Obadiah hadn't deliberately throttled down the blast to avoid killing him, that shot would have easily melted Ethan's helmet and left him far worse off. Gritting his teeth, Ethan sensed the suit's interior temperature spiking. Sweat rolled down his face before his body could adjust, triggering the armor's coolant system to kick in and stabilize the heat. Channeling the arc reactor's energy into his chest, Ethan formed a concentrated beam. With a sudden roar, the repulsor cannon unleashed, firing a blast that caught Obadiah squarely in the chest. "Sir, energy at 50%, Jarvis reported coolly. "I know," Ethan panted, "but I'm not calling for backup yet." "Mr. Ethan's comm line is standing by. Shall I connect you?" Jarvis offered. Ethan shot a determined glance at the display inside his helmet. "Negative. I can handle this." He hadn't even deployed his heavy ordnance. Solid metal or not, Obadiah was vulnerable. Raising his gauntleted hand, Ethan locked on to the lumbering figure and unleashed an anti-tank missile that streaked toward its target with deadly precision. Tony's latest upgrade to the anti-tank missile, his second iteration, was locked onto Ethan as the boy flew through the air. Tony added a secondary thruster that propels the warhead into supersonic speeds and reprogrammed the proximity fuse so it will detonate within 1 meter of its target, guaranteeing an explosion even on a near miss. Still, Obadiah's enhanced neural reflexes detect the launch instantly. By comparison, an average person's reaction time is about 300 milliseconds, and it only worsens after age 30. Even elite sprinters, trained to the crack of a starting pistol, only trim their response down to 150 to 180 milliseconds. Science holds 100 milliseconds as the absolute human limit. In track races, any reaction faster than 0.1 seconds is ruled a false start. Thanks to the compound number 1 transformation, Obadiah shatters that boundary, his reflexes so blisteringly fast that he can actually track the supersonic missile as it streaks toward Ethan. Obadiah had been trading arms long enough to recognize an anti-tank missile on sight. It dwarfed the Hellfire rockets fired from Apache gunships. A single Hellfire could level a house or cripple a tank, but Stark Industries' anti-tank warhead, at $100,000 a shot, promised total annihilation. No repair, no salvage. Doubtful that even his reinforced steel armor could withstand the blast, Obadiah still trusted his reflexes. With Tony's eyes widening in disbelief, he twisted aside at the last instant. Boom! The missile slammed into a nearby apartment, erupting in a fireball that blew a gaping hole in the wall. Quick as a viper, Obadiah pivoted and struck back. His helmet's targeting sensors locked onto the threat, and the shoulder-mounted plasma fusion cannons unleashed twin bolts of superheated energy. The air itself shimmered around the shots. "Sir, temperatures have spiked to 3,000 degrees. Jarvis reported instantly through Obadiah's comlink. How can his mech be this agile? Ethan barely registered the thought before slamming his thrusters to full power. His armored suit roared to life, lifting him off the scorched tarmac. Hot on his heels, Obadiah unleashed a barrage of high-energy plasma bolts, streaking through the sky. Ethan's eyes widened. Where's he pulling all that energy from? He knew his own reactor was running on empty, and worse, Obadiah was tapping into the very core he'd stolen. With that stolen power, Obadiah's mech punched through the air as if it had no weight. Ethan climbed higher, hoping altitude would buy him a moment's respite. But Obadiah matched every boost, every maneuver, his rockets and thrusters firing in perfect sync. Double acceleration. Hydra's science really was something else. There's nowhere left to hide, Ethan. Obadiah's voice crackled over the comm. Ethan twisted midair, barrel rolling to dodge an incoming plasma bolt. Sky and cloud blurred around him as he darted left, then right, chasing impossible escape angles. Yet no matter how unpredictable his path, Obadiah stayed right behind him. And then, without warning, Obadiah raised his arm cannon, locking it dead center on Ethan. Silence fell for a heartbeat, broken only by the hum of two reactors at their absolute limit. Then the first shot cut through the air. End of chapter. Chapter 133. Invincible. Ethan pressed himself against the girders of the ruined overpass, heart pounding as plumes of smoke curled around him. He crouched in the shadows, scanning the sky for any sign of Obadiah's steel suit. He knew that suit couldn't fire palm-mounted energy cannons, so what was Obadiah planning? Before he could figure it out, two crackling arcs of blue plasma snapped shut overhead, pinning him in place with sizzling heat. In the same instant, a mechanical claw shot out from the armored gauntlet, its interlocking pincers clamping around Ethan's torso like a vice. His breath caught in his throat as the metal digits ground tighter. "Farewell, Ethan," Obadiah's voice crackled through the suit's speakers, cold and triumphant. Ethan's reflexes screamed at him to fire back, but his chest-mounted repulsor was running on fumes. He fumbled for the energy gauge inside his helmet HUD. 10%, Jarvis reported, the calm digital tones at odds with the crisis. 10% would barely jostle Obadiah's claw, let alone cushion his fall if the fight went airborne again. He had one chance. Ethan focused every ounce of willpower into that final surge. He ignored the searing pressure of the mechanical grip and channeled the dwindling power reserves into the chest repulsor. The countdown in his vision blinked. 5, 4, 3. With a roar of displaced air, the repulsor erupted. Blue-white energy surged out, melting through the gauntlet's steel tines in a shower of sparks. The claw snapped open, and Ethan tumbled backward from the wreckage of the overpass, plummeting toward the city below. Jarvis's urgent voice echoed in his helmet. Brace for impact. Descent speed, 200 miles per hour. Ethan gritted his teeth. The suit's thrusters were offline. There was no time to think, only to act. As the ground rushed up to meet him, Ethan steeled himself for whatever would come next. He refused to die here. He would not let Obadiah win. Tony Stark's gauntleted hands dug into the metal girders as Obadiah's claw tightened around the arc reactor in his chest. The energy cannon on the forearm unleashed a pair of brutal plasma blasts, each hotter than 5,000 degrees Celsius. The first volley ripped through the claw's surface plating, showering sparks everywhere, but the main frame held fast, squeezing relentlessly. Tony could almost feel the heat scorching through his armor, and for a terrifying moment, he wondered if his own body could survive such an onslaught. All he could think of was Pepper Potts. Pepper, hoping she'd never have to identify what was left of him. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a new presence tore onto the field. There was a thunderous crack as the claw exploded into jagged fragments. Tony's vision blurred for an instant. When it cleared, he found himself sliding free, propelled through the air, safe from the plasma bursts that followed him in rapid succession. He came to rest 30 feet away, back against the hangar wall, blinking at the dim glow of the star-lit sky beyond. "Need a hand, Mr. Stark?" The voice was crisp and irreverent, just loud enough to slice over the roar of alarms and splintered steel. Tony turned his head. Hovering there, arms casually folded, was a young man in a sleek prototype suit that gleamed cobalt blue under the hangar lights. In the dim emergency glow, the new armor's jet nozzles still pulsed with residual energy. Tony recognized the stance, confident, unhurried, and the faint whir of servos that hinted at inhuman speed. Jarvis's synthesized tones crackled through the comm. "Sir, an unidentified high-velocity object was detected moments ago. Cross-referencing biometric data, identity confirmed, Mr. Ethan. I recommend we schedule a serious upgrade for my tracking protocols." Tony exhaled so hard the last whine in his chest cavity hissed out. He pushed himself off the wall. "Ethan," he said, straighter than he felt, "I don't know how you pulled that off, but I'm glad you did. You sure you're ready for this?" He offered a crooked grin, half pride, half cautious worry. It was sent every day a kid showed up and single-handedly tore apart Obadiah's latest killing machine. Ethan folded his arms, fine dark hair ruffled by residual thrusters. "I'm good, Mr. Stark. I just hate seeing you stuck in one place." Tony's grin softened into something warmer. "All right, kid, let's see what we can do about unsticking me, and then we'll figure out how to deal with your mentor over there." He lifted his repulsor gauntlet. "Jarvis, bring the suit systems back online, on my mark." "As you wish, sir." With the digital hum of reactivating circuits, Tony felt himself steady again. And for the first time in the middle of chaos, he let himself believe they might just pull this off, together. Ethan stepped forward with casual confidence, and Tony Stark couldn't help but see him as a kid, albeit one with more bravado than most. He might not have Spider-Man's crowd-pleasing charm, but investors were already lining up, eager to throw money at him. "Mr. Stark," Ethan said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile, "if this were you, I'd probably hesitate, but if it were him," he glanced over at Obadiah Stane, "wouldn't you consider tearing him apart the same as wrecking your company's property?" He spread his arms. "Humph. Useless junk, really. I've got plenty more where that came from, so feel free to smash it to pieces." Tony frowned, baffled. The kid hadn't even glanced at the Iron Man suit he'd so carefully crafted. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Obadiah Stane, equally surprised, recognized Ethan in an instant. "That's what I'd like to know. Security footage caught your fight, and citizens already called the police." Ethan's expression remained unruffled. "This is a Stark Industries matter. Do you, an outsider, really think you have the right to meddle?" Stane opened his mouth, then hesitated. He hadn't even seen when Ethan moved fast enough to shred his mechanized claw, or how he did it. "I'm not an outsider, Mr. Stark," he said at last, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Ethan stepped into Stark Industries' grand boardroom as Tony Stark looked up in surprise. "I'm the majority shareholder of Stark Industries," Ethan announced coolly. Tony frowned. "I don't remember seeing you in the board meetings." "That was before you returned from overseas," Ethan replied. "I quietly bought out a number of shares from other stakeholders. Now I own 25% of the company, second only to you." Tony blinked, stunned. He'd been planning to roll out a new arc reactor, an innovation that promised not only clean, limitless power, but also massive profit. He certainly hadn't expected Ethan to muscle in like this. Before Tony could react, Ethan reached out and shoved him aside with a single, effortless sweep of his arm. Tony's Iron Man suit clanged into action, lifting him off his feet, but Ethan wasted no time. His eyes suddenly glowed a fiery red, and beams of concentrated energy shot from his pupils straight at Obadiah Stane, who'd been watching from a nearby console. Tony's visor zoomed in. Energy projection from the eyes. The two crimson bolts struck Stane's armored surface, cleaving through the alloy plating with a sizzling hiss. Enraged, Obadiah retaliated instantly, unleashing two high-energy plasma streams aimed at Ethan. Unfazed, Ethan met the blasts head-on, and with nothing but his bare hands, he swatted each plasma beam aside as if they were mere insects. Tony hovered, utterly speechless. He'd built the most advanced suits in the world, and never in his wildest dreams had he thought his own shareholders could pack that kind of punch. What kind of body can survive a 5,000-degree plasma blast? Obadiah Stane stared in disbelief. Ever since he'd first fired that cannon, no one had shrugged off its attack, until now. "Goodbye, Mr. Stan." Ethan said, voice calm. He raised a single hand and unleashed a wave of pure chi. It struck Obadiah like the blast from a 105mm howitzer. The force was absolute. Stain's enhanced armor splintered, and he disintegrated midair, his remains raining down in fiery fragments. On the tarmac below, Director Coulson and his S-SHIELD agents gaped at the sky. Explosions and tracer rounds tore across the clouds, an aerial battle the U.S. military had been poised to respond to with a Jericho missile strike. In the original timeline, Washington had ignored the two unidentified flying objects. This time, thanks to S.HIELD's override, Pentagon launch codes were locked out. "Sir, Tony has no chance against Stain," Agent Coulson started, but his words caught in his throat when he saw Ethan swoop back into view. "Wait, Ethan's coming down!" Coulson exclaimed. In a final display, Ethan summoned another surge of chi to obliterate any lingering threat. Then, as the sky fell silent, Ethan and Tony Stark descended through the smoke toward the battlefield below. Hydra's technology had always been top-notch, but tonight, even the best enhancements couldn't withstand raw chi. The skies cleared, leaving only burning wreckage and the two men who defied a plasma storm. Obadiah had barely reached the platform when Ethan was already standing before him. No warning, no sound, just pure, terrifying speed. That's the nightmare of facing a Kryptonian. Their bioenergetic shield neutralizes any supersonic impact, and they move with ghost-like stealth. Instinctively, Obadiah swung his mechanical arm. The hydraulic servo, rated for hundreds of tons of force, should have shattered anything in its path. Instead, Ethan caught it in one hand and held it motionless. With his other hand balled into a fist, he stepped forward. Boom! The sound was like 1,000 cannons firing at once. The upper half of the Steel King's suit disintegrated instantly, and with it the ace pilot inside. Shards of metal and spray of blood arced through the air, splattering the floor hundreds of meters away. Tony and Agent Coulson stood frozen, mouths agape. Tony stared at the wreckage, heart sinking. His brand-new Mark IV, fresh out of the foundry, lay in fragments before him. He'd have to start all over again. Chapter 134. I am Iron Man. Tony Stark hovered in midair, replaying the calculations in his head. The force of Ethan's pallone would have shattered reinforced steel, but he'd felt it strike his armored suit like a freight train. Desperation welled up in Tony's chest. How could a mere human hit that hard? This guy wasn't the product of any experimental body mod program. He was a bona fide superhuman. Tony's mind raced through Ethan's other feats, the searing heat vision blast that had singed the room, the energy wave that followed, and of course, the effortless flight and raw strength. If Ethan counted as powered, he was in a league of his own. Tony drifted closer, arms crossed. "You really into Superman, kid? First you're flying circles around me, and now you're shooting heat rays." Ethan gave a shrug and a half smile. Who wouldn't want to be Superman? "Don't play coy," Tony shot back. "That was heat vision you used just now." Ethan nodded, eyes thoughtful. Superman's vision is usually subtler, more like thermal waves or radiation than a visible beam. Some of the older films only show a ripple in the air, no color at all. But these days, to really drive home the raw power, they go full-on red, blazing hot light. Think Henry Cavill's Superman, or the way Doomsday tears through Metropolis. Tony let out a low whistle. "So, your origin story involves comic books, huh?" He cracked a grin, flexing his gauntlet. "Welcome to the big leagues, pal. Let's see what else you've got." "Really?" Tony froze at Ethan's words, a wave of childhood nostalgia crashing over him. Suddenly, he was that kid again, poring over Superman comics. He'd long since abandoned that teenage fantasy, yet here stood Ethan, the real-world, scientific Superman, achieving with his own mind what Clark Kent could only dream of. If Howard hadn't been so obsessed with Captain America, maybe Tony himself would have pursued the super soldier serum. Who knows? We might have ended up with a Superman-esque Tony Stark. Sometimes Tony thought his father really had no idea how to raise a child. Now staring at Ethan's unwavering confidence, Tony felt every one of his 30-odd years. Ethan had dared to chase his dream, and through relentless research, had fashioned himself into a god among men, encased in living steel. It was like looking in a mirror. The same brilliance, the same unbridled youthful energy, the same sharp wit, and supposedly the same rugged good looks and stature. Handsome? Tall? Mr. Stark, let me remind you exactly how tall you are, and don't convince yourself that the Iron Man suit's interior padding contributes to your height. Mr. Ethan, Agent Phil Coulson stepped forward at once, eager not to miss his cue. Shall we proceed, sir? I'll take the lead. Ethan hovered a few feet off the ground, the soft hum of his armor powering up around him. Stark, he called, voice steady over the comm. On it, Tony replied. He cut in over Agent Coulson's channel. Let me handle this. Ethan doesn't need to deal with you guys. Ethan gave a curt nod and shot upward, vanishing into the night sky. Coulson tilted his head back instinctively, following the streak of light. A flush of envy crept over him. To fly like that, unbounded speed, limitless power, that had to be the kind of rush most people only fantasized about. Down in the S-Yield command center, Nick Fury's eyes stayed glued to the monitors. On screen, Ethan and Obadiah tumbled to the ground and immediately launched into combat. Each repulsor blast and armored punch lit up the night like fireworks. Fury winced at the echoes of Carol Danvers' signature style, though Ethan was no Captain Marvel. He remembered Coulson's briefing. Tony Stark had come within seconds of death tonight. And now, Stark had equipped a teenager with supersonic flight and a combat-ready exosuit. Fury leaned closer to the display. The suit's thrusters glowed with afterburner intensity, its repulsors seared the pavement, and its reactive plating absorbed blow after blow. Tony Stark had done it again, built a weapon that defined the rules. Nick Fury straightened, jaw set. If Stark's latest creation was this powerful in untested hands, S.H.I.E.L.D. needed answers, and fast. Both Tony Stark and Ethan's recent exploits convinced Nick Fury that the time had come to move forward with his plan. Fury's expression darkened as he muttered under his breath, Hydra. He had just learned that Hydra had kidnapped Tony and reverse-engineered the very suit he discarded during his escape. If Hydra could replicate Stark's armor, it meant they'd fully cracked its technology, and that was a chilling prospect. Ethan's violent dismantling of the so-called Iron King suit proved just how lethal this technology could be. He'd smashed it to pieces with a single strike to prevent Hydra from securing the experimental plasma supermelting cannon he'd built almost as an afterthought. The weapon's destructive potential was off the charts. If S.H.I.E.L.D. or Tony ever got hold of it, they'd reverse-engineer it in no time. And worse, Hydra might already be steps ahead. Yet Tony had navigated the public relations fallout with surprising finesse. Dozens of onlookers had filmed his armored rescues and posted the footage online. S.H.I.E.L.D. had rounded up witnesses to testify, preparing for every angle. Still, when the dust settled, Tony Stark did what no one expected. He threw caution to the wind and publicly declared, I am Iron Man. The nickname itself had begun as a throwaway comment on a fan video. Someone called him Iron Man because of that gleaming red-gold armor. Tony had protested that his suit wasn't made of iron, but by then, Iron Man had become his signature, and the world had embraced it. Chapter 7. Fury's Midnight Visit. Nick Fury sat alone in the dimly lit living room of Tony Stark's Malibu home, staring at the high-tech security console he'd just overridden. He was troubled, but not surprised. Headaches ran in the Stark bloodline, after all. If Tony didn't court chaos, he wouldn't be a Stark. Still, Fury had spent too long on the sidelines. Now that Tony had proven his worth, it was time to move. Everard Phil Coulson's latest report sealed the deal. He'd found hard evidence that Obadiah Stane was in league with Hydra, selling Stark Industries' most advanced weapons to their terror cells. Worse, Hydra had kidnapped Tony in Afghanistan. From the pattern of transactions and intercepted communications, Fury was convinced there was a Hydra cell, if not an entire base, lurking in that region. That knowledge wouldn't let him rest. In the original timeline, Fury had simply monitored Tony's palladium poisoning from a distance. Not this time. This time, he intended to crush Hydra once and for all. So he'd slipped in the moment Tony Stark publicly revealed himself as Iron Man. Now Fury sat on Stark's sofa, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the front door. Exactly at midnight, the heavy oak swung open. Tony strode in, still buzzing from the press conference, his iron shirt untucked and a satisfied grin on his face. Fury didn't bother standing. He gestured to the seat beside him. Welcome home, Iron Man. Tony dropped into the chair, chest heaving with excitement. You heard the news, right? I just told the world I built a flying suit of armor. I heard, Fury interrupted, leaning forward. He let his gaze settle on Tony's chest, on the slight arc reactor glow through the fabric. Then he looked up, deadpan. Iron Man, huh? You really think you're the only one special? Tony's grin faltered. Fury's words were a challenge, and beneath that, a warning. The game had changed. Fury was here to make sure Hydra paid for every weapon sold, every life destroyed, and that Stark's legacy didn't burn out before it could shine. And Tony Stark, self-proclaimed Iron Man, was going to help him do it. Well, how about we go meet the one-eyed man? Tony had barely stepped inside when Nick Fury spoke. Fury didn't even notice the strain in Tony's face. Your camouflage is useless on me, he added coolly. My visual nerves only need the faintest light to see clearly. Tony hesitated, searching for a response, but Fury went on before he could open his mouth. The director's gaze was unblinking, his eyes calibrated to pick up any glow, starlight, moonlight, even the faintest ambient gleam. Where an ordinary person would be swallowed by darkness, Fury saw every detail as if it were high noon. Chapter 135, Ethan and I Kill Each Other. Nick Fury couldn't suppress a tiny grin. He thrived on high-stakes scenarios like this. In an instant, Tony Stark's mind was racing through every worst-case possibility. His Malibu home was equipped with top-of-the-line security, yet here stood this intruder, calm as you please. So let me get this straight, Tony said, crossing his arms. You're with Hydra? Not Hydra, Tony, came the brisk reply. Nick Fury stepped fully into the foyer's glow. I'm Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Tony's brow shot up. Agent Coulson's boss, then? And you think it's fine to just break into people's private residences? What's your angle here? Fury shrugged, entirely unfazed. We don't answer to the U.S. government. You can't call the cops on us. And rest assured, I have zero interest in commandeering your armor. Tony narrowed his eyes. Not under U.S. command? So you're telling me S.H.I.E.L.D. reports to the United Nations? Fury inclined his head. You catch on quick. We operate under a UN mandate, which places us beyond any one nation's domestic law. Tony let out a slow chuckle as realization dawned. Of course, a U.S. agency wouldn't dare stage a home invasion under its own jurisdiction, but with UN backing, Fury was free to sidestep every legal barrier Tony knew. Well played, Tony said, shaking his head with a wry smile. I guess that explains why you didn't worry about the castle doctrine. Fury's expression didn't soften, but in his eyes was the unmistakable glint of victory. Tension crackled between them, and Tony knew this unexpected encounter was far from over. Humph, if you're not here for my suit, then why are you? Tony Stark folded his arms, unimpressed. Fury's story sounded like smoke and mirrors. Why should he trust a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent when they'd say anything to get their hands on his tech and leave him bankrupt in the process? I'm just curious, Tony said coolly. Why the sudden willingness to show your face? Nick Fury met Tony's skeptical gaze and bit back a retort. He'd been coveting the Iron Man suit's technology for months, but he knew getting it out of Tony would be damn near impossible. This wasn't Ethan. Tony had no interest in hawking dangerous weapons or selling Compound Number 1, let alone a super soldier serum to the highest bidder. Ever since Hydra had managed to steal one of Stark Industries' prototypes, Tony's resolve had only hardened. He'd shut down the entire weapons division. With Obadiah out of the picture and Ethan, the company's second-largest shareholder, raising no objections, the rest of the board had no choice but to follow suit. Stark Industries' stock price had plummeted to an all-time low, but Tony was already plotting his next move. He believed a turnaround was just around the corner. Ethan's confidence in himself was unwavering, and Tony admired that without a word. To show his gratitude and to solidify his support, Tony reallocated 5% of Obadiah's holdings to Ethan. The remainder of Obadiah's shares reverted to Tony, boosting his own stake. He fully intends to use the ongoing market slump to repurchase more shares on the cheap. With this adjustment, Ethan now controls 30% of the company, Obadiah retains 13%, and Tony commands 40%, with share buybacks still in progress. Seeing Ethan wield such near-absolute authority, unencumbered by outside investors, stirred a mix of envy and respect in Tony. At the same time, Tony has recognized fundamental flaws within Stark Industries. The recent decision to shutter the weapons division isn't about cutting costs alone. It's a strategic move to refocus the company's mission. Stark went public not chiefly to raise capital, but to cultivate connections within the arms industry. Now that Tony is steering the firm toward advanced technologies and clean energy, those old alliances threaten to anchor him to a past he's determined to leave behind. By downsizing, or eliminating the weapons arm, he can strip away outdated relationships and clear a path for the next chapter of Stark Industries. Tony Stark leaned back in his chair, a wry smile playing on his lips. Then why should I hide who I am? Ethan never did. Across the table, Nick Fury regarded him steadily. You're not Ethan, Tony. You're Iron Man. Public figure, headliner, symbol. There's a difference. Tony waved a dismissive hand. I'm not interested in playing a masked playboy on the surface while moonlighting as some secret dark knight. I am Iron Man, and Iron Man is Tony Stark. A hero's job is to stand tall in the light, to inspire people, and remind the world that they have someone watching over them. Fury's expression didn't change. And Hydra? Hydra's hardly top tier, Tony replied confidently. Their operatives aren't even using their powers to full effect. A little surveillance, some targeted research, and we'll know exactly where to find them. Fury raised an eyebrow. You sound entirely too sure. How can you be certain Hydra's assets are limited to the few enhanced individuals we've already encountered? Tony's grin faded. He flicked through a series of security feeds on the holoscreen. Because their new assaults are surgical, precise, calculated strikes. They're acting with the precision of a scalpel. That means someone's coordinating them at a level we haven't seen before. Fury leaned forward, steepling his fingers. So you're saying there's more to this than just a handful of powered operatives? Exactly, Tony said. And it's only a matter of time before they make their next move. If they've upgraded their entire playbook, we need to be ready for whatever comes first. Nick Fury stared at the holomap hovering over the war room table, its lines tracing Hydra's intelligence network deep within American soil. They've built an extensive, highly covert operation, he said. If we go in alone, they'll pick us apart. The moment they study our tactics, it's over. Tony Stark leaned forward, tapping his prosthetic fingertips together. I'm not planning to do this solo. Fury raised an eyebrow. Who else are you bringing in? Tony let a slow smile spread across his face. Ethan. Fury's single eye widened. Ethan. He'd always assumed Tony and Ethan were at odds. Until last night, Fury didn't even know Tony had quietly transferred 5% of Stark Industries to him. Now it made sense. Tony had a reason to trust him. You two working together? Fury's tone was skeptical. Tony nodded. Ethan may have used Hydra assets to build his empire, but that doesn't mean he's loyal to them. He wants them gone as much as we do. Fury tapped his chin, considering. Hydra isn't our only threat, he warned. Superpowered individuals are cropping up everywhere, and there are anomalies we still don't understand. Tony met Fury's gaze, resolve in his eyes. I know, but with Ethan's resources and your intelligence network, we finally have a shot at taking Hydra down for good. Fury leaned back, folding his arms. All right, let's see what the two of you can do. Ethan slipped into the briefing room, just as Tony Stark was planting himself behind the conference table. Tony glanced up, eyebrow arched. Agent Fury says we need both of you on this, he teased. If you and I teamed up, we could handle 90% of the world's problems ourselves. Nick Fury, seated at the head of the table, cracked a rare smile. That's exactly why I'm here. I need you to believe there are threats out there you can't just blast away. He leaned forward, voice low. For example, Tony drummed his fingers. Go on. He still couldn't imagine anything stronger than his repulsors and Ethan's uncanny ability to neutralize any target. Fury's expression grew serious. The military once tracked down a green monster, brought in a tactical squad, even dropped a small nuclear warhead on him. The blast barely made a dent. The monster walked away unscathed, while every last soldier didn't. Tony frowned, recalling only a flash of that battle. The final showdown, where the Hulk tore through the abomination and General Ross ordered him locked up. It happened, Panette at the tail end of that film. They'd barely gotten wind of the Avengers initiative yet. You're talking about the Hulk, he said softly. Fury nodded. That's him, and he wasn't alone in testing the limits of firepower. There are other anomalies we're only beginning to catalog, beings and phenomena that laugh at conventional weapons. That's why I need you two. Together, You bring the firepower and precision no one else can match. But you have to trust me when I say there are threats out there, even you can't solve on your own." Tony exchanged a look with Ethan. The challenge was clear. S-Shield wasn't just asking for backup. They were counting on them to face the impossible. And for once, the two of them might actually need Fury's secrets as much as he needed their strength. Chapter 136, Tony's Reluctance. Nick Fury slid a slim dossier across the conference table. "The Avengers Initiative," he announced. Tony Stark glanced at the cover, then looked up with a smirk. "Avengers? Sounds like a rock band." Fury's expression darkened. He lifted the file and set it squarely in front of Tony again. "Not a band, an elite task force, our world's finest heroes assembled to counter threats nobody else can handle." Tony folded his arms. He wasn't about to accept orders from anyone except Pepper, Happy, or Peppa, the executive assistant who ran Stark Industries with an iron will. Fury cleared his throat and pressed on. "This universe is vast. Decades ago, an alien armada attacked Earth. We were on the brink until one woman, Carol Danvers, single-handedly drove them off. She was our first superhero." Fury's voice was matter-of-fact, even revealing classified details about the Kree fleet just to underscore S.Shield's role. He needed to convince Tony and Ethan, whose superhuman gifts and friendship with Stark were practically legendary, to join, because if he coaxed those two into his fold, convincing Black Widow and Hawkeye they were equally indispensable would suddenly seem a lot more plausible. Tony leaned back. "I appreciate the pitch, Nick, but I've got my suits and my own agenda. I don't need a team." Fury's jaw clenched. Recruiting the brightest minds and greatest fighters in the world was always tougher than it looked. Nick Fury leaned back in his chair, weighing his next move. He needed operatives with enough authority to keep both Tony Stark and Ethan in check. "Why wasn't I informed about this?" Tony demanded, his disbelief cutting through the room like a laser. "How did word of this get out? Are we really supposed to admit that we almost went under because of an alien invasion?" Fury offered a calm, measured response. Tony hesitated, then snatched up the dossier lying on the table. "Who's on the roster?" he pressed, flipping through pages that yielded no familiar names. "It's classified," Fury replied evenly. "You'll get the details once you clear the proper channels." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. At the moment, the only two agents he could officially confirm to Tony were Natasha Romanoff and Clint Barton, Black Widow and Hawkeye, respectively. "Captain America is still recovering," Fury continued. "He's off the books for now." Tony glanced up. "And Ethan? He's on your list too, right?" "We're evaluating him," Tony admitted after a moment. Fury nodded once. He had no intention of hiding his own interest in Ethan. "Good," he said. "If that kid's in, I'm in." Tony snapped the dossier shut and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. But Fury's expression darkened. This wasn't some simple recruitment drive. It was only making things more complicated. Nick Fury had called in two of his most capable operatives, his field commander Ethan and the ever-independent genius Tony Stark, for a top-secret assignment. But Fury knew exactly how that meeting would end. Stark's pride wouldn't allow him to follow orders he didn't fully understand, and Ethan, the consummate professional, wouldn't sign on to a mission without clear objectives. If both men refused, Fury must be sitting on information so explosive that even these two couldn't be trusted with it yet. No sooner had Fury walked away than Tony's curiosity ignited. He plunged into S.Shield's classified archives, scanning mission logs, security briefings, and debriefs, all to unravel Fury's hints about an impending alien invasion and Earth's first superhero. In a world steeped in DC mythology, everyone grasped the idea of a lone costume champion, but nowhere in official records did any name or date appear. When, Tony wondered, did this proto-superhero single-handedly repel an extraterrestrial armada? Next on Stark's agenda was the elusive Green Beast, another casually dropped reference from Fury's briefing. Rumor had it that this was no ordinary biological weapon, but a living force locked away in S.Shield's deepest vaults. Stark cross-checked satellite feeds, reverse-engineered encrypted comm signals, and even grilled low-level analysts, only to hit dead ends at every firewall. Of course, Fury had anticipated Stark's prodigious investigating and erected layers of secrecy so impenetrable that not even Secretary Pierce, or astonishingly, Commander Hill, knew Fury could have summoned Captain Marvel back into play, much less why. But Tony Stark didn't accept no for an answer. If Fury wouldn't open his files, Stark would find a way to crack them. After all, in Tony's view, the ultimate weapon is knowledge, and he was determined to arm himself. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running through the facts one more time. The Skrulls had covered their tracks so thoroughly that even after Rhodes was replaced, nobody on Earth noticed. It was nothing short of outrageous, and he still had more questions than answers. He picked up his phone and dialed Tony Stark. The line clicked alive. "Hey, Mr. Stark?" Ethan began, playing up the formality. Tony's laugh crackled through the speaker. "Come on, Ethan. Drop the Mr. Stark. Call me Tony." Ethan grinned, even though Tony couldn't see him. "All right, Tony, if you insist." "Much better," Tony said. "You sounded like you just stepped out of a period drama." Ethan turned serious. "Listen, have you heard from Nick Fury lately?" There was a pause. "Fury? No, I haven't. Why?" "He's supposed to be running S.H.I.E.L.D. now," Ethan explained. "I expected him to come by, or at least send someone to debrief us on the Skrull situation." Tony's tone grew thoughtful. "Last I heard, Natasha resigned. Whatever report she was compiling never made it to Fury's desk. Without her intel, he probably doesn't have the confidence to move forward." Ethan nodded, knowing he spoke into silence. "Makes sense. No widow, no briefing. I just hope he doesn't forget about us completely." "Keep your phone nearby," Tony advised. "Fury may be tied up, but he won't let this slide forever." "Thanks, Tony," Ethan said, easing back again. Having a timeline, even a vague one, was better than none. "Anytime," Tony replied. "Stay sharp." Ethan hung up and stared at the ceiling. He knew the Skrull threat was only going to get more complicated from here, especially once Nick Fury finally showed up. But at least now he understood why Fury had stayed away, and that gave him something to work with. Under these circumstances, it's unlikely Nick Fury will keep looking for him. Tony Stark turned from the holographic display and faced the young man at his workbench. "Ethan, what do you think we should do?" Ethan lifted his gaze, cool and confident. Even though he was decades younger than Stark, he carried himself with a swagger that reminded Tony of, well, Tony. "Honestly, Mr. Stark, I'm surprised you even asked. We're the Avengers. We make our own calls. Why listen to someone else's opinion?" Tony leaned back against the edge of the bench and folded his arms. "This isn't about handing over your decisions. It's about talking things through. It doesn't mean you'll change your mind just because I've shared mine." Ethan's brow rose. "With all due respect, sir, no one's going to persuade me to abandon my instincts, especially not you." Tony let out a low chuckle. "You know, you're more arrogant than I ever was." Ethan gave a dismissive shrug. "Please, you're the one with the bigger ego." The remark stung, just enough for Tony to grin. He recognized the same bright defiance he'd once worn like a badge. Let the kid think he was on equal footing. It would only spur him to prove otherwise. "Fine," he said. "Tell me your plan then. Who are the Avengers going after? Because right now, it sounds like we're not accomplishing much." Ethan leaned in, the tension between them crackling in the workshop lights. "Trust me," he said. "I've got ideas you haven't even considered." Tony Stark ran a hand through his hair, staring at the holo display flickering before him. Ethan hovered nearby, watching the lines of code and schematics dance in midair. "That's exactly it," Tony said, though he sounded more puzzled than convinced. Since meeting Ethan, his outlook had shifted. He no longer followed Nick Fury's Avengers initiative blindly. Compared to the wider stakes Ethan had shown him, Fury's plan now seemed small-minded and half-baked. "Ethan," Tony went on, "I admit Fury's Earth's Mightiest Heroes pitch isn't all that, but something at S.H.I.E.L.D. feels seriously off. Ever heard of Project Pegasus?" Ethan paused mid-scan, surprised. "Project Pegasus? No, I haven't. But give me a bit, I'll dig into it." Tony swiped at the display. It was a top-secret S.H.I.E.L.D. program from the last century, supposed to harness cosmic and extra-dimensional energies. Officially, it was shut down decades ago, but if someone's revived it, or worse, weaponized it. He let the unfinished thought hang in the air, heavy as a thundercloud. Ethan's expression grew grim. If that's true, Fury could be backing the wrong horse, and the collateral could be catastrophic. Tony nodded. "Exactly. We need to find out who's really pulling the strings behind Pegasus, and fast." Ethan squared his shoulders. I'll start infiltration protocols tonight. I'll track every lead on that project, no matter how deep the rabbit hole goes. Tony's eyes shone with determination. Good. Let's show Fury that the real Avengers aren't just soldiers in a lineup. They're the ones who actually save the world. Chapter 137. Who else but me? Ethan already understood what Project Pegasus really was. The scraps of information Tony had let slip were nothing more than surface-level noise. Nick Fury wasn't foolish enough to store the full dossier in any database. Anyone poking around S.H.I.E.L.D.'s servers would come up empty. To grasp the truth, Ethan had to rewind all the way to the end of Captain America: The First Avenger. That's when Tony Stark, in the course of retrieving Steve Rogers' body, unexpectedly uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the Arctic ice. There, glittering in the vault's recesses, lay the Tesseract, the cosmic cube. Within months, Stark joined forces with Peggy Carter, who was still an agent in the Strategic Scientific Reserve. Together they founded S.H.I.E.L.D., installing Carter as its inaugural director. Backed in shadow by the U.S. military, Stark Industries, NASA, the Air Force, and S.H.I.E.L.D. quietly pooled their resources and greenlit Project Pegasus. Although the codename Pegasus only surfaced offhandedly in Iron Man 2, its real purpose had been deeply buried since that first Tesseract discovery. Tony's private excitement over unearthing Howard Stark's research notes on the cube was the only tangible clue to Pegasus's secret ambitions. From that moment on, the project lingered as an undercurrent throughout the Iron Man saga, ever hinted at but never truly revealed until now. Ethan raised an eyebrow. An alien invasion? Tony Stark leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. That's exactly what Nick Fury told me. Earth was invaded, and the only thing that saved us was the world's first superhero, and she happened to be female. He paused, letting the information sink in. If this were merely another terrestrial threat, say Hydra's enhanced operatives, I'd have it under control. Hydra's so-called super soldiers aren't evolving. They're just humans with a few chemical tweaks. They haven't figured out how to advance their powers or weaponize them more effectively. It's like giving a chimpanzee a gun. They can pull the trigger, but they're not improving the weapon's range or accuracy. Tony's confidence flickered for a moment as he glanced at Ethan. Give me time, and I could neutralize every last one of them. But aliens? I've never even worked on warp drive tech, let alone extraterrestrial biology. I don't know where to start. Across the table, Ethan processed the gamble Tony was asking him to take. He'd built his reputation on facing down threats no one else could handle, global-scale disasters, rogue AI, you name it. But aliens were a whole different ballgame. Tony folded his arms. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s been keeping tight security over a classified zone for weeks now, and the U.S. military's been on full lockdown. Whatever's out there, it's big enough to make the brass pull out every card they've got. So, I reached out to you, because if there's anyone who can stand toe-to-toe with forces we don't even understand, it's you, Ethan. Ethan met his gaze steadily. All right, he said at last. Let's see what the universe threw at us, and how we're going to stop it. Locals claimed they'd seen massive, fiery objects streaking down from the sky, but those reports vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. It took a concerted effort to dig up anything concrete. Tony Stark presented everything he'd uncovered: witness statements, blurry photographs, even seismic readings. On paper, it looked like a routine U.S. military rocket test. After all, the official logs simply described it as a military exercise. But no ordinary drill drags on for days. Once the debris had settled, the Pentagon cordoned off the area and ordered a full evacuation for over a week. If this was really an alien incident, Tony argued, it was precisely the break Ethan needed. Ethan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the scattered documents. All right, Tony, let's team up. Stark tapped his tablet, a confident smirk playing on his lips. Forget signing on with Nick Fury's Avengers. We don't need a squad of super soldiers. Just the two of us. And a little ingenuity. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So what, we're forming our own secret society now? Should we recruit Reed Richards next? Tony chuckled, shutting down his tablet. No Illuminati, no capes, just two guys hunting the truth. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching Tony Stark's latest proposal unfold on the holoscreen. Alongside a handful of the world's greatest minds, Tony had quietly formed a new organization dedicated to solving humanity's biggest crises. Their very first triumph, at the behest of the Illuminati, was the creation of the legendary Green Hulk, deployed to neutralize the Sentinels and strip them of their threat. On paper, it sounded spectacular. In practice, Ethan found the whole affair exhausting. He'd long since grown tired of Nick Fury's endless pitch for him to join the Avengers. If this was just another version of that, he wasn't interested. "Mr. Stark," Ethan began, keeping his tone neutral, "this is an incredible plan, but is it just the two of us, or—" Tony shook his head, smiling wryly. "Not at all. As soon as we spot candidates with the right skills or the right temperament, we recruit them. No government oversight, no shadowy spymaster telling us what we can or can't do. We set our own rules." Ethan nodded. In a way, Tony's stance made perfect sense. Distrust of Washington ran deep in America, especially among the business elite, who tended to view the government more as a custodian or watchdog than a partner. Oddly enough, this routine suspicion of authority seemed to be the abnormal thread in Tony's original arc. By conventional capitalist logic, he would have cut ties, gone it alone. Yet when the real name registration controversy erupted, it was Tony who clashed head-on with Captain America. An astonishing twist. In Ethan's mind, their roles should have been reversed. Cap standing by Stark's side, Stark supporting Cap's principles. Instead, they found themselves bitter adversaries. He rubbed his chin, considering. "So we're building something entirely outside of S.H.I.E.L.D. or any government body? A self-governing league of remarkable individuals?" Exactly. Tony's eyes sparkled with that trademark blend of challenge and excitement. "We solve problems on our terms. No more waiting for bureaucrats, no more endless debates. We act." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in a long while, the idea of working with a team, an independent, unstoppable task force of geniuses, felt intriguing. And if Tony Stark was in charge of the roster, you could almost guarantee the mission would be anything but boring. Ethan studied Tony across the workshop's low glow. "Tony, you have to understand, no government will tolerate a self-appointed band of superheroes operating above the law. Batman doesn't exist in the real world." Tony's grin was half amusement, half challenge. Yet here we stand, with Batman and Superman in our corner. Ethan shook his head, though a hint of a smile played at his lips. Even two legends won't be enough by themselves, and let's be honest, laws are just toys for those who know how to bend them. Tony had made that point before, and now Ethan saw its appeal. Aligning with Tony, pooling their resources and intellect, there was a thrill in it. "All right," Ethan said, "if we're forming a team, what do we call it? We can't very well be Team Stark." Tony leaned back in his chair, that familiar air of overconfidence wrapping around him like a second skin. The intellectual gap between them had finally closed, revealing a shared creed. If you wanted something, you engineered a way to get it, rather than wait for permission. Their tactics might differ in detail, but their ambition was identical. "How about the Illuminati?" Tony proposed, voice steady. Ethan let the name hang between them. It was audacious, suggesting secret knowledge, world-shaping influence, a new chapter in human evolution. Perfect, he decided. Exactly the kind of banner two men who believed the rules were meant to be rewritten would rally under. Ethan tapped a finger on the glowing hollow screen, raising an eyebrow at Tony's question. "A parliamentary system? Absolutely. But listen, no one here trusts any single leader to keep us all in line. So instead of another government agency, we'll form something above politics, an independent body of heroes, by heroes, and for heroes. Think of it as a new round table. Every member equal, every voice heard." Tony leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his face flickering with reflected light. "You're calling it—" "What again?" "Illuminati," Ethan said, choosing his words carefully. "The word means those who bring light to the darkness. That's exactly who we need to be." He let the name hang in the air for a moment. "We won't answer to any government. We won't accept orders from any council. We'll guide the world ourselves, quietly, effectively, and as a team." Tony chuckled, but there was a spark in his eyes. "You know, that's a mad scheme, but it's brilliant. And if anyone's crazy enough to pull it off, it better be us. After all, if the world's going to have true peace, it'll take people willing to do what others won't. People like us." Ethan's lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Exactly. So, are you in?" Tony nodded, leaning forward until his image filled the hollow display. Count me in. Let's light this world on fire, just enough to burn away the darkness. Chapter 138, Powerful Alliance. Ethan nodded, meeting Tony's gaze. So we're on the same side. Tony leaned back on the couch, steepling his fingers. He let out a slow breath. Who else but us could shoulder the burden of saving the world and keeping it that way? He paused, then added with quiet resolve, Our first target is Hydra. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Hydra had always been a shadow lurking at the fringes of global security. Now, it had become the planet's greatest threat. Recent events had convinced everyone it was a Hydra resurgence. Catastrophic attacks, unprecedented in scale, had swept across continents. The world blamed Hydra. What no one realized that these atrocities were orchestrated by Ethan himself, operating under the codename Black Caesar. In doing so, he'd inadvertently strengthened Hydra's brand far beyond its historical might. Tony tapped his fingers on the armrest. The real Hydra leadership, he said, is scrambling. They can't figure out who's behind the new wave of terror. They've combed every corner of the globe, yet still haven't found Black Caesar. Which suits us just fine, Ethan replied. He'd kept his true identity close to the vest for precisely that reason. Tony continued, Here's the catch. The old guard at Hydra is dying to recruit whoever this Black Caesar is. They think if they can persuade him to their side, they'll reclaim their former glory and become unstoppable. Ethan allowed himself a small ironic smile. They have no idea they've already been manipulated. Tony leaned forward. Then we've got our opening. If we strike Hydra's command centers now, before they consolidate power under Caesar's legend, we might just dismantle them for good. Ethan stood, resolve hardening in his eyes. Let's finish this. Tony rose as well. Agreed. Time to take the fight to Hydra and make sure they never threaten the world again. They shared a nod of grim determination. The alliance was formed, their target chosen. Hydra would fall, and with it, the greatest threat the world had ever known. Tony swiped through the files on his tablet. Even if our suspect isn't directly tied to Hydra, it wouldn't surprise me. Hydra needs operatives who are ruthless and unpredictable. I've cross-checked every known target of theirs. There's no obvious link. Ethan leaned closer. If there is one, it's that the victims are all invisible wealthy people. But that's a weak thread. Tracking them down is a logistical nightmare. No, Hydra isn't after money. They've never extorted or moved a single asset. Their goal is plain and simple, to spread terror. On the screen, Tony zoomed in on a close-up of one of the attacks. See this? Highly professional, and always aimed at those upper-crust types. In a twisted way, they've built a grassroots following among the lower classes, people who enjoy watching the 1% get taken down. Ethan nodded. Tony hesitated, a grin playing at his lips as he considered pointing out that neither of them exactly qualified as ordinary folks. Relax, Tony added. I hate those rich pricks too. You don't have to give me that look. Ethan laughed softly, then shook his head. All right, so if what you're saying holds true, Hydra isn't interested in terrorizing the general public. They're targeting the elite, raising the stakes without touching innocent bystanders. Tony tapped the screen again. Exactly. Our next move is to find what these victims have in common beyond their bank accounts. Same social circles, same investments, same charity boards. Whatever it is, it'll be our in. Tony frowned as he reviewed the latest intelligence. Their goal is to sow fear among the upper crust. But why target the very people who hold all the power and resources? He'd grown up in those circles and knew them intimately. It didn't make sense for Hydra to assail the elite without purpose. Could it be, he ventured, that Hydra is secretly backing one faction of high rollers against another? Ethan glanced at him thoughtfully. You're suggesting they're weaponizing terror to tip the scale, in a corporate or political power struggle. Tony's expression brightened. He hadn't considered that angle, but it explained too much. Hydra's near-omnipotent intelligence network and those inexplicable data leaks. What if rival tycoons were funneling resources to Hydra, using the organization as their clandestine strike force? That's exactly it, Tony agreed. If Hydra's attacks are sponsored by competing elites, we should be able to trace money flows or other support structures. Let's find their hidden patrons. He turned to the holographic console. Jarvis, cross-reference every recent Hydra operation with offshore accounts, shell corporations, and known associates of major families or conglomerates. Flag any financial anomalies or encrypted communications that point to private sponsors. Right away, sir, Jarvis replied. As the data streams in, each entry lighting up the display, Tony and Ethan exchanged a determined look. Exposing Hydra's backers wouldn't just gut the organization. It would unmask the shadowy power brokers who thought they could manipulate the world from behind closed doors. And Tony was more than ready to bring them into the light. Not only did Tony Stark and Ethan join forces to found the secretive Illuminati, but outwardly, Stark Industries and the Imperial Corporation also announced a blockbuster partnership to dominate the emerging new energy market. As soon as the news broke, public opinion exploded. Both Stark and Imperial were already corporate titans. Together, they now threatened to monopolize a sector that everyone agreed would reshape the world's energy landscape. Even the formidable Rockefeller family, whose fortune and legendary Mobil Trust had been built on oil, found itself scrambling to respond. They, too, had been eyeing new energy as the next gold mine, but no rival could match the combined might of Stark and Imperial. Worse yet, Tony had invited Ethan to spearhead several flagship projects under the joint venture. Ever easygoing, Ethan nonetheless worried that such concentrated power might tip the world into chaos, but for now, he was eager to seize the opportunity. Ethan could hardly pretend he didn't know the stakes. Opening a new energy market would inevitably draw the wrath of the entrenched oil barons and might threaten the livelihoods of millions of tanker crews. But none of that was his problem. He was here to have fun. The real burden lay squarely on Tony's shoulders. Nick Fury, of course, saw things differently. He'd watched the Rockefeller family's mixed loyalties with a wary eye, and the recent Stark Industries Monarch Corporation merger only deepened his unease. Tony and Ethan were off striking out on their own, leaving Fury cut out of the loop, and that unsettled him more than he would admit. After all, Tony and Ethan were his two top choices for the Avengers. Add in the fact that Steve Rogers had just been recovered and was about to be thawed, and you had the making of an iron triangle: Stark, Rogers, and Ethan. To Fury, Captain America was the obvious leader, a living emblem of justice, a moral beacon who could unite any team. Ethan, by contrast, was a relative unknown, and a foreigner to boot. He wasn't a superhero vet like Black Widow, nor an agent as seasoned as Bear. Fury trusted Rogers. Tony he respected, but Ethan, well, Fury wasn't yet sure where he fit in. Hydra's sudden emergence with genuine superhuman abilities has left Nick Fury alarmed. Relying on just Black Widow, Hawkeye, and Captain America feels increasingly inadequate against an enemy that can shatter concrete with a single blow. Fury finds himself questioning the very purpose of the Avengers. If Iron Man and Ethan aren't part of the roster, how can a trio of ordinary heroes stand a chance? Desperate for a solution, Fury decides it's time to bring Ethan into the fold, and fast. Meanwhile, the world watches in awe as Tony Stark and Ethan join forces. Their alliance isn't merely a tactical partnership. To the public, it's the moment when fiction finally crossed into reality. After all, comic boo, giants from Marvel have always had their fans in the DC universe, and vice versa. Now, with Ethan stepping up to repel Hydra's first attack, people everywhere are calling him a superhero of their own. They've even given him a nickname that captures his commanding presence: Emperor. At first, someone suggested dubbing him Superman, but the analogy didn't quite fit. Unlike the caped icon of Metropolis, Ethan isn't just the embodiment of virtue. He's also a billionaire industrialist. Emperor feels more appropriate. It reflects both his power and his unshakable confidence as he stands alongside Iron Man against Hydra's growing threat. Ethan couldn't have cared less whether people dubbed him Superman, Man of the Ancestors, Almighty Man, or even God on Earth. None of those nicknames held a candle to the title Emperor. Chapter 139. Illuminati recruits new members. Ethan had the distinction of becoming the very first real-world superhero, and he quickly amassed a devoted following. When Tony Stark stepped forward and publicly revealed that he was Iron Man, the public embraced him as their second genuine hero. Observers were struck by how much Stark resembled Bruce Wayne. Both were fabulously wealthy and incredibly gifted. The key difference lay in their approach to secrecy. Batman went to great lengths to conceal his true identity, whereas Tony Stark famously declared, "I am Iron Man," in full view of the world. Despite that boldness, many Americans still regarded Stark as a real-life Batman. In a culture that prizes openness and self-expression, Batman's covert tactics felt out of step, too mysterious, too reserved. Americans weren't shy about who they were or what they stood for. They believed in proudly proclaiming their achievements. In their eyes, Tony's upfront style was far more authentic than hiding behind a mask. Consequently, Iron Man quickly became, for many, the truer embodiment of a modern superhero, even before they knew about the secret behind the suit. Tony skimmed the intelligence briefing and let out a derisive laugh. "Batman? I'm Iron Man. You can't compare a comic book vigilante to the real thing. If I wanted, I'd buy DC, write a scenario where Batman challenges Iron Man, and watch him eat my dust." He shot Ethan a sideways glance. "And calling you Superman? Please. You're no Boy Scout with a cape. You're the Emperor, brimming with confidence and raw talent. Sometimes I wonder why I ever admitted I'm Iron Man." Ethan leaned back, eyes sparkling. "Regret it, do you? I happen to think Iron Man suits you. Unless you'd rather go by Super Stark?" Tony rolled his eyes. "Or maybe Battlesuit Man, since my real advantage is the armor." He paused, then grew serious. "But enough jokes. The U.S. military's been stirring the pot lately, and I've uncovered something big." Tony leaned forward, a mischievous spark in his eyes. "How would you like to meet a certain violent green beast?" Ethan's brow shot up. "You mean the Hulk?" Only days had passed since the Illuminati formation, and yet Tony Stark already had a fully operational intelligence network. Ethan couldn't help but be impressed. In such a short time, Stark had uncovered everything about the Hulk's whereabouts and the U.S. military's failed attempts to apprehend him. General Ross had never made much effort to conceal his obsession with capturing the Hulk. Washington knew all too well that Ross poured vast sums into the hunt year after year without ever getting close to success. Then, almost overnight, the Monarch Corporation had appeared on the scene. Ross's budget was slashed, his influence waned, and rumors circulated about his growing resentment. No wonder. Monarch boasted formidable backers and cutting-edge human enhancement programs, most famously their Compound No. 1 project. Their breakthroughs in gene therapy and biomechanical augmentation had outpaced every military R&D lab in the world. Even Ross, despite his public grumblings, understood better than anyone not to cross them. He might envy Monarch's tech, and by extension Ethan's own work in human modification, but he had no choice but to swallow his pride and back off. Now, with Tony's invitation on the table, Ethan realized one thing. The Illuminati were moving fast, and if they intended to confront the Hulk, they weren't wasting a second. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "You're wondering how I know about the Hulk?" Tony's eyebrows shot up. "Of course I am. How could you possibly?" "Let's just say my field of study is human biological enhancement," Ethan replied smoothly. "So the Hulk isn't exactly obscure to me." Tony watched him narrowly. If Ethan had that information on his own, did he have military contacts, or had someone in uniform slipped up? "All right," Tony said. "Tell me everything you know." Ethan nodded. "The military calls him the Hulk. He's the product of an experiment overseen by Jenner, Ross. Whatever they did to him, the result is a being of incredible strength and near invulnerability. According to the records, not even a nuclear warhead has left a scratch." He paused. "The man who transforms is Dr. Bruce Banner, a genius scientist with multiple PhDs. Tony let that sink in. A green behemoth unfazed by nukes? It was more than formidable. It was practically godlike. He tapped a finger against his jaw. "Interesting," he admitted. "That definitely raises the stakes." A slow grin spread across Tony's face. "Well, my Mark V6 armor just came online. In my simulations, I've been testing it against Steel King. But long-term," he added, looking Ethan squarely in the eye, "my real benchmark might just be you." Chapter Tanks, Shattered Ambitions. Ethan's punch that pulverized Steel King had obliterated Tony Stark's entire strategy. Although Stark recalibrated his Iron Man armor in a heartbeat, even he couldn't deny the vast gap between himself and Ethan's raw power. Before Prototype Mark X, Stark had never once considered going head-to-head with Ethan. And yet here he was, formulating a single tactic. No matter how invulnerable Ethan appeared, surely he couldn't emerge unscathed from a nuclear blast. Stark reasoned that if his suit could accelerate to match Ethan's flight speed, he could lead him out of the warhead's blast radius mere seconds before detonation. Once clear of the fireball's core, any residual shockwave would be harmless, even to someone as durable as Ethan. The logic was sound, but deep down, Stark refused to believe that this carbon-based juggernaut, this so-called Hulk, could truly survive a nuclear explosion intact. It defied every law of physics he knew. "So you want to recruit him?" Tony asked, voice low. "Convince him to join us?" Ethan tilted his head, surprised by the suggestion. It was the Illuminati's original sin that had driven the Hulk away. They'd exiled him, cast him out from their halls of power. Instead of quelling the threat, their banishment only catalyzed his transformation into an even more fearsome adversary. Now the Hulk had returned, transfigured, merciless, determined to annihilate every Illuminatus, every so-called hero who had once turned their backs on him. The consequences of their actions had come roaring back to haunt them. Yet here they stood, with few options left. Befriending the being they'd once exiled might be the only way to avert total catastrophe, but could they truly trust a creature whose fury they themselves had unleashed? Ethan stared at Tony in disbelief. "They're really trying to recruit the Hulk?" Tony nodded, calm and confident. "Yes, Bruce Banner isn't just a genius. He's got the muscle to match. That's exactly what the Illuminati want." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Think about it. This group is built on extremes, unrivaled intellect, and unmatched strength. We already have you, Ethan, the strongest man on Earth in our ranks. We have the finest scientific minds, too. But when we're up against Hydra's schemes or some unknown alien threat, half measures won't cut it. The Illuminati must be the best of the best. Only then can we stand as humanity's protectors." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've read every one of Banner's papers. He's not like those opportunistic experts who peddle theories for fame or profit." Tony grinned. "True, and as for raw power, I can't say I've ever faced the Hulk in combat." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Tony tapped a small console beside him. "No worries. I had Jarvis pinpoint his location. He's currently in New York doing what he does best." A grin spread over Ethan's face. "Sounds like our next target." Chapter 140. The S.H.I.E.L.D. director is detained by security guards. Ethan stood on the rooftop, gazing out over New York's glittering skyline. He'd heard that Bruce Banner had come looking for Mr. Blue, no doubt intent on another brutal bout between the Hulk and Abomination. With a wry smile, Ethan anticipated the clash. Hulk versus Abomination was imminent. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Listen, Ethan," Tony Stark said, his tone more measured than usual. "I'm not going to stop you from meeting that rampaging green monster head-on, but whether you walk away a winner or a loser isn't the point. Survival is." Ethan knew Tony was trying to temper his pride. Stark didn't fully understand the Hulk's unpredictable strength or uncanny intelligence, and he feared Ethan might be overmatched. "I'm not reckless," Ethan replied with calm assurance. "If I can't handle him, I won't engage." "You have my word, Mr. Stark." Tony exhaled, relief softening his voice. "Good. Of course, I'd still rather you come out on top. You're by far the most sensible person in this whole circus." He shrugged, half-smile flickering. After ending the call, Ethan turned and headed down into Imperial Corporation's headquarters. As a child, he joked that a worker's true home was their company. Now, as the company's CEO, he realized just how much truth there was in that old saying. This place wasn't merely his workplace, it was home. He stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, outside, a convoy of S.H.I.E.L.D. SUVs rolled up to the building. Armed agents leapt out, flanking the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. as he was led from a sleek black vehicle. In a swift but silent operation, the director was escorted inside and detained by security officers. Another unfolding drama in a city that never slept. Ethan couldn't help but compare his new accommodations to all the other places he'd stayed. By far, this was the nicest. As he settled in, he outlined his plan aloud. "Banner, here's what we do. We draw Abomination into a Hydra trap. We don't kill him. Heck, we don't even knock him out completely. Because Ross will demand custody. It's so him. Once he's got Emil Blonsky in handcuffs, he'll order Hydra to stage some high-profile raid, then happily take the heat for it. He doesn't mind being the villain, as long as he comes out on top." Ethan shook his head at Ross's audacious rise. Ever since the Abomination incident, Ross had leaped ahead to become Secretary of State, No Senate hearings, no public promotions, just a straight shot to the top. Only in America, he thought wryly. Just then, the comms chirped again. "Ethan, you won't believe who's outside." It was one of the security officers. "Nick Fury's at the gate, says he wants to see Tony Stark's setup. But our guys wouldn't let him in. They even called the police." "Are you serious?" Ethan muttered, pressing the intercom button. A gulf between worlds this big, and still nobody trusts anyone. He hoped Fury had better luck with the cops than he'd had. Ethan stared out the tinted glass of the black SUV as it rolled through the district, Imperial Corporation's tower looming ahead. Few companies could boast direct ties to the FBI, CIA, and the IRS, let alone supply them with experimental enhancements. Yet here they were. The IRS bought Compound Number 1 and the so-called Superman serum to enforce tax collection with brutal efficiency, while the FBI and CIA quietly stocked up on anything that promised an edge. Even the Black Palace's personal security detail relied on Imperial's superhuman cocktails to keep their blades sharp. Nick Fury had never expected Imperial Corporation to negotiate straight with the FBI director himself. When the call came, announcing a formal meeting with the man at the top, Fury nearly laughed. Heald had impersonated agents of the FBI and CIA more times than he cared to count, each operation a drain on government coffers, each deception justified by the end goal. Now the FBI had returned the favor, and in doing so handed our director a golden opportunity. Within hours, the FBI's chief stood before Congress brandishing evidence that Fury's organization was squandering taxpayer dollars on clandestine missions the Bureau could have carried out itself, it was implied. To make matters worse, Imperial security forces had forcibly detained a senior Heald official on site. The public outcry was inevitable. How could Fury claim to uphold American interests while operating in the shadows and under Imperial's thumb? Deep in the bowels of Imperial Tower, Fury's expression was as dark as the unlit corridors around him. He knew the fallout would be fierce, but he was more concerned with one glaring omission. Ethan still hadn't shown up, and from the look in Fury's eyes, it was clear he didn't intend to. Ethan's low opinion of Nick Fury dated back to the chaos of the secret invasion. Fury, Ethan thought, was just another troublemaker, no better than the agents of the DCI Bureau, always stirring up more problems than they solved. So, when Fury requested a meeting at Tony's villa, Ethan couldn't understand why he'd bother. Fury, in turn, didn't expect to be stonewalled. He slipped onto the villa's grounds easily, there weren't even guards posted, and confidently announced himself. But once inside, he ran headlong into Ethan's reputation. As the de facto second-in-command at Imperial Company, Ethan's word was law. With the company's CEO out of town, every staffer was determined to keep Ethan happy. In their world, crossing a major capitalist was far riskier than denying the FBI, even its director. Within minutes, Fury realized he'd hit a wall. There was no door to knock on, no secretary to charm. His badge meant nothing here. Begrudgingly, he turned and left, nursing the sting of his first outright defeat. As he drove away, he kicked himself for one misstep. If he'd sent in Black Widow instead, leveraging her clearance and reputation, he might have walked right through those gates. Instead, he'd come alone and ended up with nothing. Ethan stared at the flickering holoscreen, replaying the transmission from Galvatron for the third time. Nick Fury's usually unflappable expression was gone, replaced by a tension so thick it felt tangible even through the grainy feed. Ethan rubbed his jaw. If he couldn't even meet with Fury in person, how on earth was he supposed to persuade him and drag both Fury and Tony Stark into the Avengers initiative? "The Skrull's refuge has been located," Galvatron's synthesized voice announced. Ethan sighed. With all his research, thanks in no small part to watching that Secret Invasion series, he'd pinpointed the hidden alien enclave deep beneath the Nevada desert. Logically, that meant he could mount some kind of operation, but he didn't want to. Ever since he'd followed the Ancient One's counsel to keep his mind clear of chaos, he'd learned to cherish a simpler life, one free from cosmic conflicts and interspecies espionage. Why should he risk it all for an external war he barely understood? And if the Sorcerer Supreme, the Ancient One herself, had shown so little interest, perhaps that was his cue to back off entirely. Surely, if the threat were truly dire, she would have intervened by now. Ethan switched off the projector and leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. Behind him, a silent console glowed with missed calls and unread messages, from Fury, from Stark, even from Bruce Banner. Speaking of Bruce, on the other side of the continent, Dr. Banner stepped off the midnight train into a deserted New York siding, his duffel slung over one shoulder. He glanced over his shoulder, paranoia flickering in his green-hued eyes. He'd hoped to return in secret, to lie low until the storm passed. But in the past week, he'd discovered two things. S.H.I.E.L.D. was on his trail. Nick Fury would do anything to contain the Hulk, even if it meant calling in dire measures. General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross had rebuffed every plea to halt unauthorized human testing. Ross's anger toward Banner was no secret, and he'd made it clear he saw the Hulk as the ultimate weapon, one he was determined to exploit. Bruce ducked into an alley, pressed himself against the brick wall, and exhaled. He was just starting to relax when a distant rumble echoed through the night. In the moonlit street ahead, a hulking shadow detached itself from the darkness, massive shoulders heaving, fists clenched. The Hulk had arrived. Bruce swallowed. Whatever lay ahead, there would be no hiding now. Back in his safe house, Ethan would soon realize that tampering with Skrulls was the least of their problems. An even greater danger was about to break loose, one born of his closest friend's darkest transformation. And this time, neither magic nor diplomacy might be enough to save them all. General Ross stormed into S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters the day after his defeat, demanding support. He laid out the crisis in stark terms, but all he got in response was a curt, "Why didn't you ask us sooner?" Fury's agents made it clear that Ross's request, though urgent, came too late. Behind the scenes, however, Nick Fury never stopped watching the Hulk. Aside from Carol Danvers, Bruce Banner remained the strongest being on the planet, and potentially its greatest liability. Fury knew Banner was attempting to vanish. No phone, no ID, no electronic trace of any kind. But S.H.I.E.L.D. surveillance was already in place. As seen in the first Avengers mission, Fury dispatched Natasha Romanoff to pinpoint Banner's location the moment he resurfaced. If Hydra hadn't made a move against Banner yet, it was only because they feared drawing even more attention. Meanwhile, another faction was quietly taking an interest, the Illuminati. In reality, only Tony Stark had the resources and the obsession to track Banner. At Ethan's request, the artificial intelligence codenamed Galvatron also began tailing Emil Blonsky, the man who'd once shared Banner's monstrous powers and who now represented a personal vendetta for Ethan. Inside Stark Tower, J.R. Vyas ran continuous biometric scans, matching body shape, stride, and skeletal structure against every civilian in the system. By late afternoon, the AI had locked onto Banner's distinctive profile. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s eyes were unblinking, and Bruce Banner's days of hiding were numbered. Bruce Banner had no idea he was in someone's sights, yet. Tony Stark, however, was already making plans to warn him, and this time he'd insist on bringing Ethan along as Bruce's personal bodyguard. True to his word, Tony tracked down Mr. Blue and led Bruce straight to him. The moment Bruce appeared, Mr. Blue's face lit up. "Good to see you, Mr. Green." Bruce returned the grin and offered his hand. "Likewise, Mr. Blue. How have you been?"